Chapter 1141. The words felt like a tidal wave amidst a calm lake. Seath might have been aware of just who Lionel was, but it wasn't until Empress Fox spoke these words that this information was suddenly known to everyone else. Whether it was the unranked or ranked armed students, the division heads, the Feathersword warriors, or even Winged Star Order himself, they all felt as though time had frozen in place. Branch family member? Who had said such a thing? If the grandson of the Northern Star Order couldn't be considered to be a member of the main branch, then who could? If Winged Star Order hadn't called out Empress Fox's title, maybe many of them would still be in the dark. But who could dare to call themselves a Luxnix if they weren't aware of the importance of the hegemonic title? Elodie, who had been forced to use his just to keep a hold of his life, suddenly laughed bitterly. He had come to just in time to hear this news and he wasn't quite sure of how to take it. It wasn't like having a Star Order grandparent was rare. In fact, all three of the arm heads could boast such a thing. Lionel had even already met the Wisdom Arm Head's grandmother, Fluttering Star Order. However, having a hegemonic Star Order as a grandparent was a different matter entirely. Those that had been crippled under Lionel's blade deflated. They had spent all their lives hearing about the coming rise of the Luxnix and the importance of the Northern Star Order to all of this. If she wanted to protect her grandson from something, wouldn't it be too easy? The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Lionel's status had gone from beneath them all to countless levels above in the blink of an eye. And the worst part was that he had the talent and strength to speak for himself. Empress Fox smiled through her tears and lowered her hand from Lionel's cheek. Stepping to his side, she wrapped an arm around his and led him forward. The pair walked toward the four pillars as though there wasn't anyone else around them. Yuri and Savant's confusion reached a new height. They had no idea that Lionel had such ties to the Luxnix. If he didn't that mean that what they had done was unnecessary? But wait, did that mean he was keeping it from Aina? Why would he hide such a thing? Of course, they had no idea that Lionel had never kept anything from Aina. Let alone the Luxnix, he had already spoken about even the Morales to her. It was just that he could only tell her what he actually knew, and he had no way of knowing how these families viewed or would receive him. In practice, he was correct to be so skeptical. Wasn't how things were going now evidence enough? He had support of his grandmother, but that clearly couldn't be said for the entirety of the Luxnix family. It wouldn't be long until the two girls understood this as well. Winged Star Order stood in the skies, his expression flickering wildly from time to time. The wrinkles on his face played between tight and loose, seemingly not understanding what state they were needed in. He looked down, his expression becoming ugly. He just noticed that there was an entourage of Viola family here, and judging by it all, their standing was not low. How else could they possibly have Seath escorting them? This only matters all the more troublesome. Visit. For the best no_underscored_G experience, but how could he just allow them to leave? If it wasn't already obvious enough, Lionel's actions and the amount of blood sent in the air painted the picture clearly. It was too obvious that this boy had animosity for them. Winged Star Order wasn't exactly sure how powerful Lionel was as he hadn't witnessed the battle, but judging by the state of things, it couldn't be poor, right? Winged Star Order grit his teeth, his internal conflict only growing. There was no point in harping on how much others would learn of this matter. The dirty laundry of the Luxnix was already being laid out. The question was, what was the risk assessment on starting this battle? He had no idea how powerful Northern Star Order was. But his spine trembled when he thought of something. There'll be a chance. So long as he's here, he'll definitely be participating in the selection. Miguel will deal with him. He has the largest reason to do so. However, a line still needs to be drawn here. Roja, are you aware of what you are doing? Visit. For the best no_underscored experience, Empress Fox continued to not answer, gingerly walking forward as though she required Lionel's support to walk at all. Winged Star Order didn't seem surprised by this lack of an answer. The name Lionel Morales was stricken from the family records 20 years ago. Your entire family line will follow suit. Empress Fox's steps paused. A fury lit within her gaze, a bit of her strength imperceptibly leaking outward. She didn't care about herself, but this was a matter of humiliation for her grandson. To bring it up so grandly like this. Her gaze shifted toward Lionel, but he didn't seem to react at all. His mind was elsewhere, and it looked as though he wouldn't react even if the skies collapsed. Realizing this, Rija's heart settled down. There was nothing else of importance here. Since her grandson wanted to leave, she would help him to leave. With slow and steady steps, the two finally entered the world of the four pillars. Withdraw. Winged Star Order commanded coldly. Visit. For the best no underscore vel underscore it understand G experience Seath's expression changed. Not only was his patriarch's emblem being treated like thin air, it hadn't even accomplished a fraction of what he hoped it would. But what was even worse was that the feather sword warrior didn't hesitate to follow these orders. These matters seemed to have defused, but the reality was that it had only set in motion something that would one day be an indelible part of the Three-Pillar Galaxy's history. At the center of it all, there would be a young woman who currently stood in silence with placid golden eyes and a dull expression. Chapter 1142. Lionel sat in silence, staring out into blank space. His breathing was even, his heartbeat was steady, and there didn't seem to be anything particularly distressing about his current mood. He had returned to the hotel penthouse, but he wasn't alone by any stretch. His grandmother sat across from him with Noah by her side. Her frail hands held onto Noah quite tightly, the two of them exchanging some words. Lionel wasn't really paying attention to what the two were saying, but he could guess. Noah was likely being his usual awkward self, something he faced whenever someone showed him intimacy he wasn't used to, while their grandmother was trying her best to toe the line between forging a relationship while not pressing too hard. Eventually, the topic of their discussion returned to the matters of all those years ago, and Rosia couldn't help but sigh. She sent a glance toward Lionel, but his gaze was still aimed out of the tall windows. It was as though his eyes could see to the very ends of planet Luxnix itself. "I take full blame," Rosia said lightly. "Ever since my birth, the Luxnix have been focused on what they call the hibernation phase. This was essentially a commitment that we made toward preparing the Luxnix for war. In the generation before mine, Ancestor Y Star Order made a prediction about the upward trajectory of our family. Though it wouldn't be as exaggerated as hyper-evolution, Ancestor felt that it would only be a step below. Should we grasp this opportunity, maybe even entering such a state wouldn't be impossible. Though I understand why Ancestor made such a prediction and chose to divulge it, oftentimes I wish that he had kept these matters to himself. Even now, Rosia couldn't help but respectfully call this existence Ancestor. In the end, unlike Lionel and Noah, she had been born and raised in the Luxnix family estate. There were many ties that she had that were too difficult to sever even after so long. "Why is that, Imperial Grandmother?" Noah couldn't help but ask. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. The initial purpose behind the prophecy wasn't in its prediction, it was to warn and stress the importance of patience. By putting a 3-generation number on it, the Luxnix formed a plan based on that assessment. The result was the most peaceful era the Three-Pillar Galaxy has ever faced. It seems like the three families are in harmony now, but the reality is that, for a very long time, there was nothing but endless battle and war. The three-planet formation was, on paper, a safe zone, but in practice, more people died here than anywhere else. The lull in Luxnix activity had a positive effect on the balance between the three families, and they too fell into a lull. This allowed the family to enter a state of peaceful growth. Unfortunately, many of the blades turned internal as a result. When a family grows too powerful, to the point they don't have any outside competitors, that is when they also become the most vulnerable. But it's functionally the same if a family is growing in power and has entered a truce-like state as well. Noah's gaze glowed. One of the things he most admired about his grandfather was the creation of the Slayer Legion. Emperor Fox knew that in the time between the Ascension Empire conquering Earth and the descent of the Metamorphosis, there would be a period of absolute peace. Due to this, it was very likely that the Empire might crumble before the fourth dimension descended. Realizing this problem, Emperor Fox didn't hesitate to sacrifice his strongest blade and turn the Slayer Legion into an enemy the Empire could unite against. Noah had no idea just what level of foresight that would take. Rosia shook her head. "In my generation, everything began well. Both the Northern Star Order and the Snow Star Order appeared, and we were even very close. The family was very cautious in that time and took the words of Ancestor very seriously. In fact, they were so cautious that neither myself nor Snow Star Order were allowed to participate in the Void Palace's selection. Visit. For a better user experience, however, as you might imagine, that didn't last for long. After your father and aunt were born, the family was a bit unsatisfied with my actions. But, because of the importance the Northern Star Order held, and the fact I was very important to the ascension mentioned by Ancestor, my actions were forgiven, but unfortunately not forgotten. During my generation, both the Viola and Montex families managed to enter a nominal student. This placed pressure on the Luxnix, and many believed we had chosen to be too low-key. So, when your aunt was sent to me by your grandfather and began to display her talents, it was already decided that she would take part in the selection. She was the perfect candidate. Her eye color was different from the usual Luxnix and made it seem like she was a branch family member. Thanks to this, even if she had an astounding performance, it wouldn't raise too much alarm toward the Luxnix main family, but she could also release some of the pressure simultaneously. Everything went well and your aunt performed astoundingly, entering as a quadrant-ranked disciple. Of course, if not for the fact Earth was still in the third dimension back then, causing her world spirit and emperor's might lineage factors to be dormant, she would have likely placed even higher. By then, her climb up the disciple rankings would have been far easier as well. But trouble came again when your aunt returned to the family pregnant. Your aunt was meant to be the perfect cog in their plans. She was just Luxnix enough to be a part of us, but just enough not Luxnix that she could be used as a tool. But your aunt didn't seem to acknowledge the fact that this was her use. Rather than marrying into a distant branch of the main family and birthing a pure-breed Luxnix, your aunt had taken the same path I did. However, once again we were forgiven. I was the Northern Star Order, and your aunt had already become a galaxy-ranked disciple. What couldn't be forgiven, though, was that little Leo was simply too talented. Rija's expression darkened, an array of complex emotions flickering through her gaze and expression. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. This was already the third and final generation, and talents continued to pop up. But there was too great of a power imbalance. Our branch of the main family carried with it too much of the talent, and we had proven time and time again that we didn't listen. When your cousin was born, the fact he almost took your aunt's life was only one aspect, but the phenomena he brought with his first cry was a different matter entirely. To be born with an innate node was already rare enough. But to have one of the caliber of the Scarlet Star innate node was a different matter entirely. I was too naive. I thought that I had shown enough loyalty to the family, even leaving behind my husband and son to remain within the estate. I took on so much work and my every day was breathed for the sake of the moment the hibernation phase would end. But that day when I saw your cousin, my little Leo, he had gone from a baby boy so large and full of life to one that couldn't even breathe on his own. His skin had paled, his eyes lost their color, he was crying, he never cried. He was such a good baby. Rija's tears fell like a flood, but her next words were laced with a dense cold. I killed them. I killed them all. Her hands trembled as though she was back there once again. She could see the cold gaze of the woman she had once called friend, she could see the impatient and condescending sneer of her husband. Everyone who had been there, looking over her grandson's small little body, watching as he struggled to even breathe without even lifting a finger, she killed them all. The very reason Miguel was an orphan, the reason he had no close relatives, parents or grandparents to call his own, was precisely because Roja saw nothing but red that day. Visit. For a better user experience, and among those that fell, was the Snow Star Order of old. Chapter 1143. It took quite a long time for Roja to calm down after reaching this part in her story. The relationship she had had with Snow Star Order was very deep. They had only been born a few weeks apart and had grown up like sisters. They had practically been attached at the hip ever since they could crawl on their own. Even after so many years, Roja couldn't find it within her to get over that betrayal. In the moment, the fury she felt for the injustice her grandson had faced trumped everything, but when Snow Star Order's blood touched her palm and the last of her blood was drained away, it all hit her like a speeding truck. Not only did someone she thought of as a sister betray her, but now she had to suffer the weight and guilt of having killed her and her entire family as well. One might say that she had no reason to feel guilty, and she had only punished those that deserved to be punished. And maybe such thoughts were correct to have. Anyone who would do such a thing to a child simply didn't deserve to live. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_g experience. Unfortunately, the human mind wasn't always strictly rational. For some time Roja only blamed herself. Maybe if she had shown the family more support, maybe if she hadn't been so selfish in her choices, maybe if she had followed the rules of the family more closely, maybe things wouldn't have needed to go so far. Roja understood why Snow Star Order had done what she did. While Roja seemed to always be able to live life the way she pleased, choosing the husband she wanted, allowing her daughter to do the same, raising a family of her own and even benefiting with talented children and grandchildren as a result. Snow Star Order never got this chance. In fact, in a lot of ways her life was made harder due to Roja. Roja got to pick her own husband, but Snow Star Order's marriage was arranged. Rija's daughter was the gem of the family, but Snow Star Order's own offspring were mediocre at best, unable to match up to the talent of their mother. Rija's daughter once again got the right to choose her own husband, but Snowstar Order had to watch as her own daughter was forced down the same path as herself. When Snowstar Order saw that Rija's grandchild was still far more talented than her own, maybe if one chose to be sympathetic, they could at least understand her thoughts and the motivations behind why she did it. While on the surface the reasoning was to bring more balance to the family and rein in what power Rija's branch seemed to be accumulating, the truth underlying those actions was jealousy. The latest _sodies are on the website. That day I was barely able to stabilize the situation, but I wasn't sure what else to do. The Scarlet Star innate node is especially volatile and difficult to handle. It was one matter if little Leo was perfectly healthy, but having already barely survived one operation, there was no telling if he'd be able to survive another. At the same time, while I held fury for their branch of the main family, the child that was given little Leo's innate node was innocent and couldn't make decisions of his own. However, at the time, it really seemed like the little one would suffer due to the decisions of his seniors. Assimilating another's innate node isn't rare, and there's even quite a large black market for it. However, how well it works is highly dependent on what the node is and how it fits with your affinities. While the little one had the important star and light elemental affinities, he lacked the fire affinity. In addition, even if he did have it, the Scarlet Star innate node is a different beast altogether. Rosé took in a deep breath and sighed. For a while it seemed that the family would lose both geniuses. Little Leo was very weak and frail after losing innate node, while Miguel was constantly suffering backlash. If not for the preparation Snowstar Order had made, Miguel would have died long ago. Unfortunately, even Snowstar Order had underestimated the Scarlet Star node, and it all wasn't enough. Seeing how things were going, even at the sacrifice of an innocent child, I was willing to attempt to transfer little Leo's innate node back to him. After all, though both children were innocent, I couldn't possibly choose another child over my own grandson, right? Plus, what life did Miguel have ahead of him? His living would only complicate the family's internal strife in the future. Visit. For the best no understanding experience, but it was then that little Val returned with your aunt. Back then he was rightfully furious. If not for the guilt I harbored in my heart, it was likely that there would be no Luxnix family remaining. I know that he was right. Snowstar Order wouldn't have done what she did without the consent of the rest of the Star Order Council, and I knew that Snowstar Order's family had ties to many other main family branches due to her and her daughter's arranged marriages. But I still couldn't bring myself to allow it. I will be as honest and upfront with you two as I can. I was weak and I was always too tied up with former ties. Due to that, I ended up alienating your aunt and your mother as well as your uncle-in-law and your father. I relied on my relationship with Eleanor to get Velasco to promise not to seek revenge. However, in return they both resented me for it. Rija's gaze grew a bit misty. Visit. For the best no understanding experience, her son-in-law was a man she never saw without a smile on his face. He always had a joke to tell or a prank to pull. She had to admit to herself that due to this she thought that he would be easy to convince. In fact, she hadn't even known the true strength of her son-in-law until after that talk they had that day. Velasco had fallen into a silence and didn't say a word to her. It was only after Eleanor described Velasco's origins to her did she understand that it wasn't her protecting Velasco from the Luxnix, but it was rather the other way around. Chapter 1144. Rija's gaze drifted to Lionel once again. But even now his gaze was still trained outside the tall windows. He didn't seem to have heard anything Roja said, but Roja didn't decide to push the matter. She didn't know what it was that Lionel was going through, but she felt like she didn't have the right to ask. She hadn't been able to be a part of her grandson's life for so long, so how could she just appear now and expect him to bare his soul to her? Soon after these matters, Velasco took little Leo to Earth. I'm not certain of what his reasoning was entirely, but it was likely that the combination of friendly atmosphere plus low-dimensional world was the best environment for little Leo's recovery. In his weakened state, staying in a sixth-dimensional world was more of a detriment to little Leo than anything else. But as for the specifics of how little Leo was cured, I'm not sure. I can only say that it's good that you've grown up so strong and powerful. A calm silence fell over the penthouse suite. The truth was that Lionel was listening, though not actively. With the way his mind worked, unless he used dream sense, it was impossible for him not to capture every little detail within hundreds of meters of himself. The only question was whether he would acknowledge it now or later. But after what he experienced today, this benefit seemed more like a curse than anything else. Lionel didn't really know what he was feeling right now. In reality, maybe his grandmother was the only one able to tell that he was feeling much of anything at all. To everyone else, his face was quite indifferent and placid, as though he didn't have any emotions to speak of at all. Who knew? Maybe it was a mother's intuition refined over 2 generations. They always say that a woman's intuition is strong. It would be one thing if Lionel had chosen to cut Aina off completely. But, according to his balance scale, she had just barely managed to stay in his heart. The issue with that was now he had to drag all of this baggage around. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, he didn't feel like doing much of anything. The moment he had seen her, it was like all the accumulated momentum and drive he had built up over this last year had vanished in an instant, drained out of him by a single look. If he was honest, it was mildly infuriating. It wasn't an anger he felt toward Aina, it was one he felt toward himself. He might have been fine with this feeling had he still had no goals or aspirations, but the current him wanted to accomplish something far bigger and larger than himself. To be weighed down by such emotion, such useless trash, it pissed him off. He almost wanted a reason, any reason at all, to cut this all away from himself like it was some sort of malignant tumor. Due to all of this, he hadn't even been able to properly react to the truth of his history with the Luxniks. Was he more mad now? Indifferent, maybe? He didn't really know. It was like his emotions were on a delayed timer, but now that the proper moment to react had passed, it was already too late to do much of anything about it. Did he want to vent? Not really. If it was about venting, wouldn't the best place to do so have been the Luxniks' estate? He couldn't very well go back. Did he want to speak with Aina? Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, he didn't particularly want to do this either. They say a picture spoke 1,000 words, well, a snapshot of Lionel's memory spoke millions. He didn't feel there would be anything to gain from speaking with her. Did he want to replace her? He felt no drive to do such a thing. Maybe a woman would help him clear his mind and focus, but whoever that woman was would only end up being a tool. At best, they'd be a prostitute. Such a person wouldn't be a replacement to begin with. Then what did he want to do? Well, sitting here felt all right. Lionel's eyes drifted close, an odd peace overcoming him. In all his calculations, the one thing he didn't note was exactly how long it had been since he simply rested. When Lionel was with Aina, even when they didn't need to sleep, they would do so. Of course, a part of that was due to their shenanigans in the bedroom, but Aina was always a reminder for him to rest as well. If there were 2 things Aina loved to do, the first was to eat a lot and the second was to sleep. With her ability, she always knew exactly what her body needed to maximize her growth into the future, so rest and food were 2 of her biggest appetites. Visit. For a better user experience, ironically, it was meeting with Aina again after so long that seemed to hit Lionel like a Pavlovian response. Before he realized what was happening, his mind sank into darkness and for the first time in a long while, his thoughts finally came to a stop. As fast as Lionel's mind moved, he hadn't realized just how much he needed sleep. He had taken on so much weight onto his shoulders in such a short time that he didn't realize just how much it was all weighing him down. What he and no one else could have possibly expected was that this rest of his would last an entire month. His mind and body both entered a state of hibernation. However, what was unique about it all was that with the second awakening of his healing branch, rest for Lionel was far different than rest for others. In the past, when Lionel rested, he would use dream sense to multiply the effect of his sleep. But that was ultimately just a parlor trick. While it would refresh his mind, his body was only falling further and further behind in its rest. This time, though, Lionel didn't have the time to activate dream sense as he wasn't even aware he was drifting asleep. The result was both his mind and body shutting down. Under the second awakening of the healing branch, after not having a proper rest in years, it was like Lionel's body was being refreshed and rebooted. It was impossible to tell just what changes there would be when he awoke. By then, though, it would be time for the selection to begin. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Chapter 1145. Eleanor sat by Lionel's bedside, her expression one of endless doting. Every so often, she would glide a shimmering towel across her son's forehead as though she couldn't stand the slightest hint of dirt or dust touching him at all. After Lionel met with her mother, Eleanor thought it would be easy to finally swoop in and see her son. But the result was actually outside of her expectations. What was something she had been looking forward to for decades became something her hands trembled at the thought of doing. In a lot of ways, Lionel falling into a deep sleep like this was a great help to her. She got to be by her son's side and take care of him without the weight of 2 decades of baggage. She felt more at peace now than she had in a very long time. Her eyes glistened with tears when she thought of all the milestones she had missed. Though she could watch them through Velasco's eyes, it just wasn't the same. She didn't get to watch Lionel take his first steps, or be there for his first day of school. She never got the chance to watch any of his football games or teach him how to impress the girl he liked. Eleanor smiled lightly, soon beginning to giggle beside herself. Her husband had always said that the worst people to ask for advice on women as a man was other women. Do you think a gazelle is going to teach a lion how to hunt them? That was what her husband had said. Velasco suffered the pinch of all pinches for saying these words, but thinking back on it now, Eleanor couldn't help but laugh. Her husband was always saying wild and outlandish things. Compared to him, her son was definitely the far more handsome and refined gentleman. Eleanor's smile became somewhat sad. She shook her head and dabbed her son's forehead again. Her son was so perfect, how could any woman make him go through such things? She didn't like this ain't at all. If it wasn't for her worrying about how her son would react, she would have taught that girl a lesson a long time ago. The latest _soties are on the website. I will change the bed sheets again. Eleanor transferred Lionel to another bed and replaced the sheets once again, even swapping out the pillows. If Lionel had been awake, he would have known where his meticulousness came from. Aina had always said his room was frighteningly clean and tidy, but witnessing his mother change bedsheets twice a day despite the fact he was giving off next to no impurities at all would make Lionel realize there was always a taller mountain somewhere. Eleanor smiled brilliantly as she laid her son down to rest again, gently combing his hair with her fingers and dabbing his forehead once more. A month had already passed by now and many were waiting on the selection to begin. However, Eleanor had told them all to wait. What a joke. These people would just have to patiently stand by until her baby boy woke up. Lionel's eyes slowly opened. Rather than feeling the usual grogginess one might expect from just waking up, especially after sleeping so long, he actually felt refreshed to an alarming degree. It was to the point where even the air he was breathing tasted better. Lionel rose up and slid to the side of the bed. His bare feet touched the soft carpet and his mind subconsciously outlined every fiber. It was like the touch of his skin was no less sensitive than his actual internal sight now. Visit. For a better user experience 67000. Lionel's pupils constricted. His number of split minds had been just over 5 million before he fell asleep, but now they were actually approaching almost 40% more. At the same time, even the most subtle of movements his body underwent made his bones crackle and pop as though they were breathing sighs of relief. Lionel didn't need to stand to know that he had grown another 2 inches. He had been about 66 before, but now he was nearly 69 or 205 centimeters. He squeezed his fists, feeling the changing as his muscle fibers flexed and blood rushed to his limbs. He could almost see the light bouncing off his tan skin as though he was truly made of metal. Though, maybe he technically was. Lionel ran his fingers through his hair. It grew out again. Lionel shook his head and with practiced motions cut it off. A slight violet glow shimmered before his hair was coerced into being cut. Finally, as always, he stored it all away. Lionel rose up, realizing that he was only wearing a pair of white boxers. He blinked, suddenly realizing that he definitely did not own these. It dawned on him that someone must have been changing his clothes in his sleep. He wasn't exactly shy, but he couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. At that moment, Lionel's stomach suddenly growled. Before he could think that he was hungry, Lionel spotted an enormous spread of food in the penthouse's dining room. He most definitely didn't need to be asked twice and immediately dove in. Bang. Visit. For a better user experience cap. The doors of the penthouse slammed open as a rush of people came in. Lionel didn't get to say anything before he was tackled and dog-piled, his poor beast leg flying out of his hands. Raja's rotund figure was the first to collide with him and Milan followed suit not long after. Before Lionel could react, he found himself being piled by at least 6 200-pound men on the most conservative end, with the likes of Raj and Milan pushing and crossing 300. Lionel coughed. You guys couldn't pick a better time? I'm starving here. Lionel's muffled voice sounded beneath the pattern. Shut up, Cap. Let me love you. Gimme a kiss. Lionel found himself fighting for his life beneath a pile of grown men, dodging lips left and right. Visit. For the best no_vel_ing experience for the first time in a while, he laughed. Chapter 1146. Hours later, Lionel seemed to have finally noticed something weird about his brothers. You all? How'd you grow so powerful so quickly? The dining room table had been cleared of all food and Lionel was even sporting a small pot belly. His stomach never showed this sort of effect after eating, so it could only be said that he had truly stuffed himself full this time. By the end of it, he finally noticed the changes in his teammates. Judging by a few factors, it should have only been about 5 weeks since the last time he woke up. Yet he could feel that the auras of his teammates were all several times stronger. If it had taken 3 of them to match a branch family member before, they could probably fight one-on-one to a stalemate now. Of course, this still left them far short of the Luxnix family main branch along with the other main branches. But it was a shocking change nonetheless. After Lionel thought about it though, he felt that it made sense. For such talents, just staying and acclimating to a 6th-dimensional world over an extended period of time would cause great positive changes to their strength. The pressure of such a high-level world would squeeze out the latent potential they had within themselves and allow their talents to shine forth. I didn't consider this before, but this is good. Right? Granny Fox has been helping us out. She made a training regimen for us all and we've been following it for the past few weeks. Franco explained. Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel's brows shot up. It took him a moment to realize that Franco was actually talking about his grandmother. His lip curled into a smile. What did she make you guys do? The dining room suddenly turned quiet. Even Alan's face tinged with red as he pushed his glasses up his nose, unwilling to make eye contact with Lionel. The only one who seemed alright was Milan. She put us through a routine of cardio and stretching, nothing major. She just said that we had the talent, it was just that our bodies had not been placed under appropriate pressure. Lionel's gaze immediately picked up the weird gazes of everyone when Milan said stretches. Suddenly he felt a great camaraderie with the brothers around him. He, too, understood the complex emotions associated with working on your flexibility. Even to this day, he hadn't allowed anyone to see him stretch using that technique he got from the Valiant Heart Zone. As for Milan, of course he was uncaring. He took his flexibility the most seriously of all of them. Despite his 300-pound frame, he had actually spent quite some time as a gymnast and even dabbled in ballet. Milan surprisingly took them both quite seriously, so he was rarely made fun of for it. Lionel was filled with sympathy. Visit. For the best no_vel_ed_g experience, the location was Planet Montex. Of the 3 families, they seemed to be the most silent, however the training their youths had been undergoing was anything but. Much like their tall mountains which pierced through their atmosphere and gave their world devilish horns, they too were stoically persistent. Maybe due to this or by coincidence, Planet Montex was chosen as the starting grounds for the selection. After over a week of delays, the selection was finally beginning and the pent-up anticipation seemed only steps away from blowing. Amongst the Montex family youths, there was one particular young man that Lionel would recognize very well. That day in the Dimensional Cleanse Trial Zone, in order to claim the 5th dimensional piece, Lionel had been forced to fight not just 1 but 2 people. One of those 2 people was Richard. The other was Higlis, a young man who wielded an enormous hammer with the weight of a small mountain. Who knew what the odds were of meeting 2 potential heirs of this 3-pillar sector at once. But all that was important was the fact that Higlis hadn't forgotten Lionel. He too had wanted to rely on the 5th dimensional layer to maximize his chances at becoming crown heir. Unfortunately, he wasn't as meticulous or scheming as Richard. The result was that he was still vying for position while Richard had already claimed his crown heir position for himself. To Higlis, this selection was the opportunity he needed to secure his position for life. So long as he could become a nominal disciple, he was set. But of course, this wasn't the limit of his ambition. Visit. For the best no_vel_ed_g experience, many forces converged onto Planet Montex. Among them, the Montex, Viola and the Luxnix weren't the only ones. There was also Raya's Sage family and numerous others who could only be considered to be a step beneath the 3 pillars. Within this throng of people, Lionel, his brothers and his friends could be considered to be the most leisurely. While others were scrambling for position, they had already found their seats. It was unknown what was being planned, and even Lionel was still unaware that the overseer of this event was actually his own mother, but the Void Palace had set aside a large arena. Or more accurately, the Montex had one built at their behest. Lionel assumed that there would be some group challenges ahead, or else Fluttering Star Order wouldn't have tried to invest so much into branch family members. But he wasn't sure if this was set in stone, or if Fluttering Star Order had only been preparing for the possibility. By Lionel's side, his grandmother held onto his arm like a frail old lady. One would think that she had a step in the grave already, but judging by her current vitality, living for several hundred more years wouldn't be a problem in the slightest. At the moment, Rija's mood was very good as Lionel's attitude toward her after waking up was far better than what she had expected. She thought that Lionel hated her, when the reality was just that Lionel hadn't been in the mood for pleasantries previously. Even knowing his grandmother's role in protecting the Luxniks, he didn't hate her. In fact, he quite appreciated her. Wouldn't Lionel be too much of a hypocrite if he hated his grandfather's actions on one end, but was alright with genocide on another just because he had been wronged? If anything, of all his relatives, his grandmother's personality was the most in line with himself. Visit. For a better user experience over the last few days, the grandmother-grandson pair had become a lot closer and Rija's wrinkles seemed to vanish one after another the longer she spent smiling. She hadn't felt so happy in a very long time, she almost didn't care what the Luxniks did from now on. Like this, the arena which could house millions was slowly filled to the brim. Chapter 1147. Lionel split a bit of his attention to pay attention to the surroundings. Truthfully, the idea of joining yet another organization made him feel pretty weird on the inside. It could only be said that his luck wasn't the best when it came to such things. Though his relationship with Camelot, the Slayer Legion and Valiant Heart Mountain could all be considered to be positive now, though the latter was now destroyed, the rockiness he had experienced at the start of his relationship with them was still firmly imprinted onto Lionel's mind. After leaving Valiant Heart Mountain, Lionel had truly thought that he would never join another organization again. He had plans to simply build up his own faction until it was time for the Morales family's air wars. Though Lionel didn't know how the Morales saw him or if they might treat him the same way the Luxniks had or not, he had enough reason to believe that so long as he won these air wars, it wouldn't matter. The fact that he had two of their most important family heirlooms in hand spoke for itself. After learning about the Void Palace, though, Lionel realized that he didn't really have much of a choice in the matter. Whether he wanted to or not, if he had aspirations of reaching the pinnacle of the dimensional verse, joining the Void Palace was a must. To describe the importance of the Void Palace in the simplest way possible, they were the guardians of the human domain. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. Any dream Lionel had of uniting the dimensional verse would, without a shadow of a doubt, have to pass through them. It could even be said that becoming the head of the Void Palace would be a shortcut, at least to claiming the human domain, that is. Even if this wasn't the case, the Void Palace had vast stores of information Lionel couldn't miss out on. Whether it was information about other domains, thoughts and ideologies Lionel had never touched before, or even something as plain as techniques and styles, Lionel had to grasp them all. It was a foothold of such importance that he could only grab onto it. Lionel had always had a phobia of missing out. Of course, this wasn't a phobia about events or people but rather knowledge. He hated the idea of taking less efficient paths simply because of his own ignorance. He had experienced that feeling all too often since he entered the dimensional verse. One such example was the truth behind why so many of the youths participating in the selection had stopped at Tier 7. Even Richard, the crown heir of the Viola, was only at Tier 8 currently. Of course, the obvious answer was that the Void Palace only accepted those beneath the 6th dimension. But this was just one layer of the answer. Firstly, if they accepted those beneath the 6th dimension, why stop at Tier 7 or 8? Wouldn't it maximize your chances if you continued to the quasi-6th dimension level? That would still meet the requirements, right? Visit. For the best no_vel_ed_ng experience you could say that maybe these geniuses simply hadn't had the time yet. But this answer only made sense for the first few times. Oddly though, every expert Lionel ran across as they continued to flood this arena were all the same. There were simply too many of them for it to be a coincidence. They couldn't possibly all be too young, right? Then there was the second oddity. Why beneath the 6th dimension? Weren't there talents of all levels to be found everywhere? The former guild head of the Milky Way Guild, Augustus, was a great example. Augustus was a special sort of talent, able to enter the 6th dimension while bound by the constraints of a 5th dimensional world. The difficulty in doing so was astronomical. Though some of this could be attributed to him taking advantage of the 6th dimensional galaxies that wanted to take advantage of him, this only went to further bolster and prove his skill. However, according to the rules of the Void Palace, they would reject him no matter what. When Lionel asked his grandmother about this, it was only at this point that he managed to understand why this was. The 6th dimension was an important crossroads and was divided into two major paths. First, there was a conventional path which essentially reboot and reframed the progress you made in the previous 3 dimensions. Visit. For a better user experience to explain it as simply as possible, with the conventional path, your 6th dimension would become a rerun of the 3rd dimension where you would form more and strengthen your innate nodes. Following this, The seventh dimension along this path would be redo of the fourth dimension, where you would once again strengthen your body. And the eighth dimension would become a reboot of the fifth dimension. Of course, those who took this path would still be able to become extremely powerful and weren't necessarily worse off than those who took the opposing path. However, while they weren't necessarily worse off, it would be impossible to reach the ceiling of those who took the other path, also known as the God path. Should one choose the God path, they would have a chance to reach the true peak of the dimensional verse. Of course, once again, those that chose the conventional path weren't necessarily weaker, and there were many who chose this path that could match top experts of the God path. However, without fail, the strongest individuals of the dimensional verse had stepped onto this second, unconventional path. In order to take the God path, however, one needed to start early. The priming for diverging and taking this route began at Tier 7 of the fifth dimension. Using that buffer period, one could slowly begin to mold themselves and prepare. Once again, Lionel realized that he had almost missed out on something greatly important. He couldn't help but feel that his dad was really too casual with informing him about such things. How could he pick any path other than the God path? Visit. For the best he experienced. Lionel's gaze suddenly shifted toward a certain direction, an aura of pure white gold descending as the Luxnix family arrived. Sorry everyone, I started on DD chapters really late today, LMAO. But you guys are probably used to late chapters by now. More on the way. Chapter 1148. The arrival of the Luxnix could only be said to be quite grandiose. Being the last of the three major families to arrive, they seemed to have made it a point to make a statement. But maybe this only made sense. After 3 generations of slowly biding their time, they could finally see success on the horizon. This selection would be the time for them to rise. An enormous golden bird flew through the skies. And yet, somehow, it carried not the slightest hint of a shadow. If Lionel had to describe it in just a few words, he would most definitely choose Golden Phoenix. It had a long and slender neck of perfect groomed plumes. Its wings gently flapped despite its size, wafting about intoxicating scents and unintrusive winds. Its tail feathers sparkled with delicate patterns, filling all those who saw it with awe. A sonorous call left the beak of the majestic bird. It rang through the arena like the clanging of a silver bell. Somehow, it didn't feel annoying in the slightest, but rather filled one with amazement and worship. By now, Lionel would have usually looked away, displaying a sheer lack of interest. However, he wasn't the type of person to fake what he was feeling, at least not when it came to matters that weren't superficial. While others saw a bird, Lionel saw one of the most elaborate and complex force arts he had ever laid eyes on. Regardless of how he felt about the Luxnix family, he didn't take his eyes off of it, his gaze filled with curiosity and awe. Visit. For the best no_vil_underscore experience, whether it was the lack of shadow, the wind-movement ratio, or even the number of people it could carry, everything about this bird seemed to defy the laws of physics and left Lionel intrigued. Creating such a lifelike creature was definitely something the Camelot magic system couldn't accomplish. While the Camelot magic system was good at taking artistic conceptions and functionally applying them to an attack or defense, it didn't have the malleability to form such a lifelike creation. Lionel wasn't very surprised by this. If one magic system could accomplish everything, then there would never be a need for so many to exist. This was especially so for force art languages. Lionel knew 3 currently. One was the Morales family's crafting arts, the second was the Camelot mage arts, and the final was the very first he had ever learned, the nameless force art capable of transcribing abilities into an art. Of them, Lionel was the most unfamiliar with the third. He always had at the back of his mind just how dangerous the person who could use this ability was, but that was about it. At the level he had comprehended it to, he could at most copy low-level abilities that couldn't even really be considered to be at the first level of an ability index. Within the piles of Luxnix core texts and teachings Lionel's mother had left behind to him, the Luxnix family's force art discipline was detailed within it as well. Until now, Lionel hadn't paid much attention to it as there were many other techniques that had caught his attention. But seeing it all at work before him left him astonished. Grandma, how familiar are you with the Luxnix force art techniques? The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. Roja blinked. She had expected that Lionel was staring so intently at the Luxnix arrival because he was still enraged or angered. She hadn't been sure of whether to try to comfort him or leave him be, but to think that Lionel was actually just observing the bird because he was curious about it. Such a turn of events left her stunned before her smile bloomed. It wasn't the first time Lionel had called her grandma, but she still felt her heart bloom whenever she heard it. She was very much excited that Lionel was actually asking something of her. I know a little. Do you want me to teach you? Rija's gaze glowed. She forgot all about the Luxnix and even forgot about everyone in her surroundings. Her only focus was pleasing her grandson. Lionel smiled. I'm just a bit curious. It's unlike anything I've seen before. I remember that elder sparking star order. When I met her before, she tapped her cane and her body was enveloped in fluttering butterflies that seemed shaped of fire. Was that an application of the Luxnix force arts? Rosia seemed to grow younger by several years every time Lionel spoke to her. Yes, you could say so. Sparking Star Order is among the most skilled in the Luxnix force arts. Are the butterflies just an aesthetic choice or? Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, Lionel actually wasn't sure. He didn't have a high enough understanding of the Luxnix force arts to make an assessment. Plus, seeing through the technique of such a high-level 6th-dimensional expert was beyond even his means. Not exactly, though, in part. Rosia patiently explained, the Luxnix force arts are very good at embodying and manipulating life force. When Sparking Star Order taps her cane and summons her butterflies, she's using a fusion of her ability and her comprehension of force arts to disperse her aura and make her teleportation impossible to track. The flapping of the butterfly's wings are more than just an aesthetic choice, as the frequency they do so at is very important. Even the most skilled of internal sights would find trouble tracking her down. It makes her movement both flexible and unpredictable. Rosia divulged a major secret of one of the Luxnix family's Star Order elders without blinking an eye. I see. Flexibility, huh? Lionel fell into thought. Rosia nodded. If the strength of the Luxnix force arts was to be described in one word, it's adaptability. What it loses out in strength, it makes up for by melding into the perfect technique for the situation. Take a sensory force art as an example. A more rigid force art language might send a ripple into the surroundings to send back a static image to the user. But, with the Luxnix force art language, you might instead form and send out several wolf constructions. Their adaptability would be several-fold greater. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, Rosia patiently taught her grandson what she knew, the two seemingly lost in their own world as the golden phoenix of the Luxnix touched down, dispersing to reveal a shocking reality. The Luxnix was being headed not by their patriarch and not by a Star Order elder, but rather a single young man of barely over 20 years of age. Chapter 1149. A subtle silence fell over the arena. While many here could be considered to have only come for the fun of the spectacle, there was a matter of perspective needed as well. This arena could sit millions. However, the population of a single planet was counted in the tens of billions. The number of habitable planets in just a single quadrant could be counted in the hundreds. The number of quadrants in a single galaxy were numerous, and the number of galaxies in a single sector could be counted in the dozens. When these numbers are multiplied out, there were easily hundreds of trillions of people in a single sector, and even that number was far too small to adequately paint the truth of the situation. And yet, there were only millions who could afford to be here. Even the most low-level heckler within this crowd was a tycoon back on their home world. There wasn't a single person present that wasn't sharp and intelligent, not to mention well-versed in the matters of politics and the importance of image. For the Luxnix to make such a grand entrance, all for the sake of allowing a young man to lead them all, it spoke volumes. In fact, it spoke so loud that everyone could only fall into an abject silence. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. Lionel, who had been speaking with his grandmother, didn't really react to this. He found the Luxnix force arts far more fascinating than whatever grand entrance they had planned. Plus, he had already heard the story about Miguel. He wasn't very astonished to feel something similar to his own innate node. That said, he sensed something quite curious about his original innate node. But he shook his head and didn't mind it. If he hadn't managed to regrow his innate node back, he might be more infuriated. But after learning what happened, Lionel didn't particularly hate Miguel. In fact, he felt quite bad for Miguel. After all, the actions of his parents caused him to be raised without family. Lionel had seen what a lack of familial love could do to a person. Every time he thought of Aina's deepest insecurities, it was often always related back to this. In addition, he could see how great it was to have great family and friends around him every day. He had grown up with his father by his side, and knowing that his mother and grandmother loved him filled him with a full sort of feeling. Even knowing that his grandfather had cut contact with his grandmother mostly due to himself even somewhat changed his opinion of the old man. Though he and his grandfather could never be on the same page, there was an odd complex emotion that Lionel couldn't help but feel knowing that the old man still loved him. But Miguel had never experienced any of this. Visit. For a better user experience, sure, there was plenty of love around him coming from the Luxnix family elders. But didn't they all just see him as a tool to be used? They didn't love him unconditionally like his mother or father could have. They only loved him insofar as his talent could bring their family to the next level. When Lionel finally looked up and his gaze landed on Miguel, what he felt wasn't rage or fury. All he felt was pity. Miguel didn't look around, nor did he react to the crowd's gaze. With light steps, he walked toward the region of participants, taking a seat in the section left to the Luxnix. His expression couldn't be said to be indifferent, but he was clearly uncaring. He felt that everything was far beneath his notice. Even knowing that Aina was nearby, Miguel didn't even glance in her direction. The matters of the bronze tablet was still at the back of his mind, but he had chosen to take these matters slowly, a single step at a time. There were simply too many ways to interpret the words of a prophecy, and he was willing to let things bear themselves out naturally. The elders of the Luxnix smiled toward Miguel with feelings of gratification clear in their gaze. Without a word, he had very clearly suppressed the momentum of all the geniuses present. How could they not feel fulfilled? Visit. For a better user experience after so long, it was time they bare their fangs. With a whoosh, the elders of the Luxnix rose to the stadium seats, leaving the ground region for the participants. Among those that had come, there was Winged, Sparking and Resting Star Order. After a quick sweep, Winged Star Order's gaze narrowed when he noticed Roja, Lionel, the geniuses of Earth, and his grandmother currently all sat on the ground floor. However, their seating arrangements were oddly luxurious, even more so than the three main families. Many had chalked it up to the appearance of Roja, but the members of the Luxnix found that there was something decidedly odd about all of this. Before Winged Star Order could think about just what was going on and understand why his heart was feeling uncomfortable, Orinik suddenly appeared in the middle of the vast arena. In that moment, a wide sweeping pressure emitted from him. Orinik was usually a calm and scholarly young man. His dark skin was always glistening and perfectly taken care of. His clothing never had even the slightest wrinkled. And his aura was always reserved and as calm as a lake. Visit. For the best no_vil_underscored_g experience after spending so long in the Luxnix family, many of the elders had come to this very same conclusion. But, suddenly seeing him flip a switch like this and release a pressure that made even them burst into a cold sweat, they finally realized just how large the difference between them and a young man who was ultimately just a galaxy-ranked disciple was. Orinik might have been amiable and scholarly usually, but right now he was representing the Void Palace, the protectors of the human domain and the greatest shield of humanity. This was no longer for himself. This would be a day those present would never forget. Chapter 1150. Orinik took a deep breath. Just this subtle action seemed to agitate the atmosphere itself, a sweeping wind flying about the arena. I will not explain to you all the weight the title of Void Palace Disciple holds, because quite frankly, the majority of you all are not worthy of knowing. Instead, I will only tell you all that if you miss this opportunity, it will be one you regret for a lifetime. Today will be the first of 3 days of trials. Usually, we have something of a more elaborate plan, but this time around we will use the simplest and most crude of methods. What Orinik didn't explain was that this was due to the actions of Lionel's mother. In order to allow the youth of Earth more spots to be selected, it could be said that she abused her power to expand the selection. This wasn't exactly rare, as many overseers would do similar things when they were sent back to their home sectors. Due to this, the Void Palace usually had a policy of sending over those who could be unbiased. Because of these factors, Alienor wasn't meant to return. But, due to the interference of Lionel's father and a series of events not many were aware of, the Void Palace ended up making yet another exception. In truth, the Void Palace wasn't too worried about this at all because, visit. For the best no_underscored experience, there will be no absolute fairness. If you cannot make it through these rounds and rise to the top in just this sector, you would have never stood a chance upon reaching the Void Palace. Don't think me out to be cruel. If anything, we are saving your lives. The selection that takes place here could never match up to even a tenth of the difficulty in the Void Palace's true selection. If you can't prove yourself here, you would never be able to do so there. Orinik's words were strict and allow no room for rebuttal. In any sort of crude tournament format, expecting fairness was impossible. Even in the case that the organizers knew every single little detail about the participants and could organize the perfect tournament brackets, there would still be a few who ended up with a raw deal, let alone the fact that the people of Void Palace had no way of knowing all these secrets. If you could perfectly predict everything, what would be the point in the selection to begin with? You might as well just pick out your favorites and get it over with. Orinik was wizened enough to know the hearts of people and how they could complain about such things, so he laid the cards out on the table immediately. He wouldn't allow the organization of this selection to go awry. With these formalities out of the way, we can begin with the rules. As I mentioned before, the selection will be divided into 3 days with ample rest between these stages. We will provide adequate medical attention during these rest days, but during a tournament day, you can only rely on yourself. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. This means there will be a ban on all extracurricular supplements. The only thing you can rely on is your own force and force replenishment ability. Those found violating this rule will be disqualified immediately. Orinik didn't explain how he would monitor such a thing when there were so many participants, not to mention countless elders with a vested interest in their juniors succeeding, but no one doubted his confident expression. If the Void Palace couldn't accomplish at least this much, they would be far too incompetent. The first day will be a group stage. The second day will be a round robin. The third day will be a special day which has an undecided format as of now. As I've already stated, this is just the beginning. Whether you will truly become the students of the Void Palace will be decided on how you perform when you reach those tall gates. However, there is still something that you can fight for here. There are an unlimited number of nominal disciple positions. Whether you can claim one will depend on your performance. Those eliminated in the first day will have no chance. However, those who can make it into the second day can consider themselves to be on a short list of potential entries. Above the nominal disciple position, there are 3 gold tokens up for grabs. These gold tokens, when exchanged at the Void Palace, allow you a chance to directly challenge to become a galaxy-ranked disciple upon entry. Of course, reaching the location to do so is not so easy. But this is a matter you will learn about in the future. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. Finally, there is the Amethyst token. In this selection there will only be one. However, just like the nominal disciple position and the gold tokens, this Amethyst token also isn't guaranteed to be given out. Orinik allowed his words to drift into the air. He wanted those here to know that there was no guarantee that any of them would be selected. There was a very real possibility that even after all 3 days, not a single token would be given out and not a single disciple would be chosen. The Amethyst token is a special token reserved for a special level of talent. Across the human domain, in a given selection cycle, no more than 2 or 3 has ever been given out at the same time. In fact, in most years, not a single Amethyst token would be awarded. The Amethyst token represents the undefeated. To earn this token, not only must you display dominance, you cannot lose. This token represents the number 1 genius of a sector, an undisputed ruler amongst their peers. Having this Amethyst token, much like having the gold token, allows you to challenge for a higher disciple rank. But, while the gold token caps you at the galaxy rank, the Amethyst token has no such cap. Whatever you accomplish will be solely up to you. The gazes of the youths all glowed with a fiery light. Just how many of them wanted to claim such a glory, to be undefeated and become the undisputed head of their generation? Visit. For a better user experience, fire burned in their chests and a blaze lit in their eyes. This glory, they would give their everything to strive for it. More coming, smiley face. Chapter 1151. Orinik's expression didn't change when he saw this, but he inwardly sneered. Orinik wasn't the kind of person to actively condescend. Or, it was more accurate to say that most who went to the Void Palace had had their arrogance beat out of them long ago. The focus of the Void Palace was presenting a single shield to the outside world. There was no individuality, no room for self-esteem and pride, there was only the task at hand and your role in said task. Despite its name and despite the prestige that came with being a part of them, the Void Palace was essentially the military. Nothing more, nothing less. To see all of these people being so excited already filled Orinik with one layer of disgust, as he too had once been one of them. But, seeing them actually pine over a reward as exclusive as the Amethyst token was enough for him to want to vomit. Did they have any idea what kind of monsters had the right to grasp such a token? Even if you really did defeat everyone in your sector, if your competition was too weak, the Overseer would never grant you such a badge. What good was it in being the best out of a group of trash? This was a sixth-dimensional sector and they actually thought they were worthy of such a thing? Was this a joke? Despite his feelings, Orinik remained silent. His force surged and he waved a hand. At that moment, an enormous billboard formed of motes of light appeared in the skies. It was entirely blank, but what was fascinating about it was that no matter what angle you looked at it from, it would feel as though it was matching your gaze dead on. The latest _IP_SODs are on the website. Lionel's eyes lit up when he saw it. It was yet another fantastic application of force arts and it left him fascinated once again. These days he seemed to be finding crafting and the underlying force art mechanisms of it more and more amazing. Those who will be participating, send out a strand of your force toward this construct. If you cannot do at least this much, Orinik didn't bother to finish his words this time. He had used this line of reasoning numerous times already. He was sure that those present understood that he wouldn't be here to listen to their complaints and nonsense. Lionel's brow raised. Controlling force outside of yourself, or at least projecting your internal force outward, could quickly become very difficult. The billboard might have seemed close, but in order for it to be so large and yet appear in everyone's vision so clearly, it had to be at least a few hundred meters in the air. Lionel could have never imagined projecting his force out so far before he grasped level 2 spear force. At least that was the case if he wasn't using his bow. Of course, since then he had become far more skilled. In addition, after learning many of the Luxnix family's techniques, he had grasped many force manipulation techniques that would make this not too hard to accomplish. But this simple test made Lionel realize just how large the gap was. At that moment an arrow shot into the skies. It streaked upward with a blazing speed before it pierced through the billboard above. Visit. For a better user experience while the arrow continued to fly higher before eventually rushing down below and crashing into the protective force arts that safeguarded the observers, the force that had coated it was completely stripped away. The billboard began to flicker and a long string of numbers appeared. 000001. There was no name assigned to the number, but this didn't seem to matter. To the Void Palace, your name was meaningless until you became one of them. All the billboard checked for was your dimension and then tied you to a number. Haha. Number 1 it is. A youth with a boisterous laughter held up his bow proudly. He didn't seem to be from one of the 3 main families. In fact, he was from a family just beneath the main 3 and, on the surface, at the same level as Raya's sage family. His actions seemed to result in a cascade of events, numerous streams of attacks rushing toward the billboard as many hurried to get their spots. One number after another began to appear in the sky, each with their own unique force signatures. It seemed impossible for one person to impersonate another, even when they used the same exact force. Orinik's internal sneer only grew fiercer. He could sense many sixth-dimensional experts trying to squeeze themselves in. Though they masked it by using fifth-dimensional force, how could the Void Palace be so easily fooled? By now dozens had tried, but each time the billboard treated them like they were thin air. Visit. For a better user experience, however, Ganner didn't have such patience. At that moment, a sweeping pressure suffocated the arena. Ganner, who had been lazily reclining on a throne-like chair on the ground floor of the arena, suddenly allowed his eyes to snap open. His palm reached out in a certain direction and the shrill scream of a middle-aged man pierced through the ambience of the arena. Before this middle-aged man could react or even fight back, they found their neck firmly grasped by Ganner's hand. No, I'm sorry. The middle-aged man could barely squeeze out those words, but the moment they did, Ganner clamped down. Many of those spectating had never seen something so horrible. A gushing rush of blood shot up from the middle-aged man's neck, his eyes popping out and his face doubling in size before his head imploded. Blood and gore sprung out in every which direction, but not a single piece seemed to land on Ganner at all. The latest _IP_SODs are on the website. The galaxy-ranked disciple tossed the corpse to the side and sat back down, yawning and closing his eyes. Orinik shook his head and sighed. If you want to keep your lives, I'd advise you stop trying. Chapter 1152. Lionel's gaze narrowed, but he didn't say much. In truth, he thought it was a bit unfair. Not everyone had the ability to be aware that they should restrain themselves within the fifth dimension, and even less knew of the diverging paths upon reaching the pinnacle of the fifth dimension. The difference being laid out before them now wasn't one of greed or overestimation, it was just one of class differences. These people simply weren't lucky enough. This was the first time the selection had been so open, and many of those who had tried just now were geniuses in their own right who never got a chance at a quota. Now that things had suddenly been open when they thought their turn would never come, Lionel could understand how they felt. If he wasn't born to such parents at the perfect time, would he have this chance laid out before him? If the Void Palace was so interested in gathering talents, shouldn't they have made a better effort? Why were there quotas, and why did they allow powerful families who were inherently selfish to begin with control them? As Lionel was thinking this, there was another individual with a dark expression. Visit. For a better user experience, if Meal didn't realize by now that what he had done was unnecessary, he would be too much of a fool. He had only gone so far because he had been present during previous selections, and even with his talent often being clearly better than that of those who participated, he never got a chance himself. He didn't want his daughter to go through the same thing, but how could he have expected that this year would be so open and free for all? Despite his fury, Meal's expression gave nothing away. He didn't cast any enraged glances, nor did he lose his cool. With things being this way, it was even better for Aina. Even if she would take on a small stain so long as she performed, there would be nothing the Viola family could do to her. At the same time, Meal marked this memory in his heart. It wasn't easy for everyone of Earth to complete this task. Some even required a few pointers from Roja before they managed to succeed. Lionel could tell that this had taken a toll on many of them. They had been so eager previously, but seeing how thousands had accomplished something they all struggled mightily with, whatever eagerness they had had was tempered down dramatically. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. They suddenly felt that the odds of them making it to the second day had gone down significantly. This sort of competition. Maybe it was too soon for them. Didn't it take decades for many to make it through the fifth dimension? They had just entered. Maybe they were in over their heads. Lionel fell silent as he felt the shift in the atmosphere. As a leader, there was a lot of things he could do, but giving people confidence they didn't or shouldn't have wasn't one of them. Something like self-belief had to be earned and trained. Often, those who had it without putting in such effort were simply overestimating themselves. A lot of things had gone too smoothly for the people of Earth. Compared to the people of the Milky Way, their talent was so much greater that how strong their foundations were never really mattered. And even when the people of other galaxies invaded, much of the brunt of the work was honestly handled by Lionel, Noah, and the other preeminent talents. Being faced with the reality now hit them all hard. Even Lionel's own brothers hadn't found the task easy to complete. Only Drake had a relatively easier time, but that was only because he was a marksman to begin with. This time, Lionel chose to remain silent. He didn't give them encouraging words, nor did he try to cheer them up. Sometimes, a person would only be able to convince themselves of what they needed. Lionel's gaze shifted and landed on Elther. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. Even compared to Noah, Elther had been greatly silent during this whole journey. After all, this was his first time hanging out with so many humans at once. It only made it more awkward that the Void Palace was meant to be the protectors of the human domain, so how exactly did he fit into all of this? Of course, Lionel had already thought of this and asked his grandmother about it. According to Roja, the Void Palace wasn't completely devoid of non-human species. There were many guardian beasts and the like, as well as a few rare humanoid species like the Oryx. Though it wasn't common, it wasn't unseen either. That much allowed Lionel to rest easy and worry about Elther a bit less. Right now, though, Elther seemed to be in his element. Seeing so many powerful enemies before him and seeing such a tall mountain to climb, his heart beat wildly, his gaze locking onto the stages ahead as though he couldn't wait to hop on. Right then, the billboard formed of motes of lights calmed. The instant this occurred, the numbers began to flicker, rearranging themselves swiftly until several columns were formed. Then, a large number of numbers dimmed while a single group of them glowed brightly. Those who can sense their auras glowing above, step forward. The first group match will begin now. Elther stood almost too quickly, a bestial aura rolling off of him in waves. His excitement was practically palpable, his handsome, almost otherworldly features gaining a menacing and devilish charm to them. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. He shot forward, appearing on the arena. At some unknown time, an enormous saber had appeared in his hands, a pervading aura of thick darkness hanging around him. This was what Elther had always dreamed of. While others thought it might be nice to win the amethyst token, he wanted it and was willing to give up anything to get it, even if he had to cut his heart out of his chest. There was nothing he wanted in life more than to become the greatest general there ever was. Today he would leave his first mark on the world. Chapter 1153. The appearance of Elther and his bloodthirsty aura seemed to cause something in the surroundings to shift. Even with how human Elther's face seemed, his tall and branching white horns stood out like a sore thumb. However, he didn't seem to care about it all in the slightest. Within the oryx there were two things a man could take pride in. The first was their smell. Out of consideration for the humans around him, Elther had always restrained his own and even masked it quite well. However, this second pride was one thing he had absolutely no intention of hiding. The mark of an oryx male, the pride of a prince of the oryx kingdom, his horns. The stage slowly filled with participants. After the initial shock of Elther's appearance and his momentum, many calmed. Right now, Elther was only at tier 1 of the 5th dimension, even a step or two behind a few of Earth's geniuses, let alone those that were here. Even the weakest of the participants were tier 4 and 5. Elther quickly fell to the bottom of his bracket. The greatest shame was that there was no one else of Earth chosen with him. Though the odds were low considering the sheer number of participants, it was now certain that Elther would be on his own. Hey. What exactly are you? Did your mom fuck a deer or something? A familiar young man stood forward, curiously observing Elther from top to bottom. He was none other than 00000001, the archer who acted first. Being a member of the Arundo family, he was quite confident in himself. Much like every other genius from a family just beneath the heel of the Viola, Montex and Luxnix, they all believed they only needed just a single chance to shoot by them in a single step. He wasn't the strongest genius of the Arundo, but he was definitely up there. If an equivalent rank was made, he would be like the rankers of the Luxnix arms, probably in the top 100. Of course, that was only if the Arundo were taken into consideration. Whether he could replicate such a feat if he was a Luxnix? The latest _IP_SODIs are on _the website. What did you just say? Elther's gaze narrowed. His saber hovered just above the platform they all stood on. However, if one looked closely after Osrin of the Arundo family spoke these words, the slightest twitch of Elther's wrist had caused the blade to nick the hard stone. The touch was so subtle and almost imperceptible that no one noticed, but the force that coated the blade cut through the stone so smoothly that not a single sound was made. To Elther, his mother was a great taboo. For as long as he could remember, it had always just been him, his father and his brothers. To birth a child with affinities for force as powerful as Lionel's Scarlet Star Force or Elther's Chaotic Particle Force took a lot out of a woman. Though Elther was birthed with an ability rather than an innate node, and the difficulty was lesser as a result, it still wasn't a smooth process by any stretch. While Lionel's mother almost died, Elther's own wasn't so lucky. Though Elther's father and his brothers never blamed him nor made him feel like he was to blame, it was still a weight he carried with him. It might very well be why he was so independent as a child, always insisting on forging his own path. For this Osran individual to dare to say such a thing to him. Begin. The final 3 will make it to the second day. Visit. For the best no _vil_undersng experience Sorenix's voice fell, uncaring for the squabbles of those on the platform. Even though there were just over 100 on the stage now, he had seen too many die in the Void Palace, all of whom were hundreds of times more powerful than the few before him. He had seen hundreds just as eager and willing as Elther as well, but weren't they all buried just the same? What did it matter? Ho, you've got a temper, huh? Did that come from the beast side of your family? Osran laughed. Bang. Elther had already vanished from his spot. His enormous saber trailed him like the tail of a comet lit by black light. Osran sneered, his bow having already appeared in his hands and 2 arrows having already been knocked. With movements as fluid as water and as easy as breathing, Osran glided backward as he released his arrows. Unlike Elther, Osran had a few members of his own family present. They entered a loose formation together, leaving the former to Osran while they targeted the remaining members of the group. Almost immediately, the group stage was divided into several cliques. Those who had less to rely on immediately voiced complaints, but Orinik turned a blind eye to them all. Hadn't he already said clearly there wouldn't be absolute fairness? Elther, though, didn't seem to care. A bestial aura continued to rise from him, the pores of his skin opening and closing as the white fur of his battle fur advanced and retreated. As furious as he was having trouble keeping it all under perfect control, but that did nothing to slow his speed in the slightest. Visit. For the best no _undersng experience, his saber glided forward, splitting Osran's 2 arrows despite their speed and appearing outside the encirclement of their loose formation. Osran's smile faded, his expression becoming a touch more serious. He hadn't expected a tier 1 to deal with his arrows so easily. But he still didn't panic, his force surging. He realized that this wasn't a place for him to fool around. Since he had caused this mess, he would deal with it quickly. Osrin knocked an arrow, his force surging. The arrow seemed to double in size in an instant, a wild and untamable silver force wrapping around it with a vicious piercing light. Osrin took just a half-second to prepare this attack. He could already see Elther's head being skewered through. But to his shock, he never got to release it. Elther suddenly vanished, his speed suddenly exploding forth. The last thing Osrin saw was the menacing glare of a beast and a row of sharp, glistening teeth. Elther's saber swung downward with such speed that nothing seemed to happen even several moments afterward. It was only after a light gust of wind blew by that Osrin fell into two halves, a bloody pool forming and filling in the cracks between the tough stones. The first blood of the tournament had been drawn. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. Chapter 1154. A mad howl left Elther's lips, a wild dark elemental force surging about his body. The members of the Arundo family were instantly caught off guard. They had only formed their formation on a whim and hadn't really considered its flaws. Elther's explosion and speed wasn't something they were able to react to appropriately, leaving them at a loss. Light elemental force was well known for a few of its abilities. Its speed, its piercing ability or its ability to solidify and concentrate, and its healing ability. Though these things could vary depending on the exact type in question, these were general abilities all light elemental forces seemed to share. Dark elemental force, however, was different. It was known for its concealment ability, its heaviness, its looseness and gaseous-like form, and for lack of a better term, its cursing ability. If these things were to be summarized, it would be that light elemental force was good at giving something of itself, while dark elemental force was good at taking for itself. In that moment, while it felt like Elther's speed had increased explosively, what had actually happened was that everyone around him had slowed down. The same had even happened with Osrin's arrows, but the effect was so perfectly timed that even Osrin himself didn't seem to have noticed the change. The shock of the Arundo immediately shifted to fury. They might have been second to the three main families, but that didn't change their view of themselves. To the rest of this sector, they were still noble and esteemed. To have one of their own killed before them like this was a great humiliation. Unfortunately, their rage didn't seem to move the needle one way or another. As for why, that was because Elther hadn't finished venting either. Visit. For the best no_vil_underscored_shinji experience, blood flowed down the stage, a singular young man standing at the center. Elther's white hair seemed particularly blinding amidst all the crimson, his breathing moving with a labored rhythm. Though 3 had been meant to pass on to the next round, the actual number seemed to just be 1. Orinik didn't seem too fazed by this result. He would just give the spot to the last 2 to be cut down if they could survive, that is. As for the rest of it, it had nothing to do with him. There was a furious sort of atmosphere permeating around the arena. Though Elther hadn't killed everyone in his group, there were quite a number that had been cut down, never to rise up again. While a few that had lost out fled the stage, many more would never see another sun rise. Did Elther feel bad? Not at all. To him this was no different from a battlefield. If you didn't have the resolve to die, then don't step foot upon this place. Elther had been on many battlefields in his life. Compared to these noble young men and women who lived lives of mostly leisure, he had a different sort of edge to him. That edge was what allowed him to see the air of a veteran of war hanging around Orinik. Maybe even faster than Lionel had, Elther realized that this wasn't a joking matter, nor would making it into the Void Palace be all sunshine and rainbows. From here on out they would wade through a sea of corpses. If those here couldn't clear this trial, they would still find themselves dead eventually. Elther slowly walked off the stage, his gait quite slow and his face a bit pale. Though he had won, he was still only tier 1. And, for the sake of the second day ahead, he had refrained from using his trump cards, making things even more difficult on him. Visit. For a better user experience, a cascade of boos suddenly began to fall from the crowd above. Seeing Elther win wasn't just something the Arundo family didn't want. As humans, they disliked the idea of someone of another race taking such a resounding victory against them. Despite his handsome face, with the exception of a few swooning women who had fallen for his devilish charm, Elther very easily became public enemy number 1. If not for fear of the Void Palace disciples and the actions of Ganner earlier making many too apprehensive to step out of line, they might have started throwing things from their stands as well. Elther inwardly shook his head. Though his father had let him come with Lionel, Elther knew his old man quite well. With how stubborn he was, the likelihood that he would allow the Oryx to follow Lionel was very low. Of course, this wouldn't be about being untrusting of Lionel, but mostly just an understanding of objective reality. Just look at how these people were treating him just because he was a bit different. Compared to his Oryx counterparts, he was about as close to human as you could get. From him, it only became worse from then on. If they couldn't even accept him, how would they accept the others? Even knowing that the Oryx only had their best chance to maximize their hyper-evolution state under Lionel, his father still chose to go his own way. And seeing such a reception, Althor couldn't blame him. Visit. For the best no_undershinji experience, Althor felt a shadow wash over him. He looked up to find a smiling face looking back at him. You did good, your saber needs some work though. You wasted way too much energy swinging it around like that. Althor was speechless. Lionel stood before him, grinning as though he couldn't see or hear anything around him. Without a care, he critiqued Althor's battle and wrapped an arm around his shoulder. For a long time, Althor didn't quite know how to respond. He opened his mouth several times but nothing seemed to come out. He had been by Lionel and the rest of the Earth geniuses for the past several weeks, but he had never really made an effort to ingratiate himself with them. He always felt that there was a barrier he could never cross over. But, seeing Lionel act like this, he suddenly felt a bit of guilt in his heart. Despite knowing he'd put a target on his back by doing this, Lionel had still stepped out without a care. Althor was quite absent-minded, so much so that he didn't even realize that it wasn't just Lionel. Looking up, he suddenly realized that everyone of Earth had come out with wide grins on their faces. Visit. For a better user experience. Chapter 1155. Who are these people? Within the Arundo family, a young man with a dark expression sat, staring out toward the heart-warming meeting between Althor and the other geniuses of Earth. Of course, in the perspective of others, this was anything but a wholesome moment. He would have liked nothing more than to put an arrow between their brows. Osrin wasn't a person he knew personally. In fact, on a normal day, Osrin wouldn't even be worthy of carrying his shoes. However, in this sort of situation things were very different. Every action made by a member of the Arundo family, especially when the person was as high profile as Osrin to begin with, was a potential boon or blight on their reputation. To a high-level family, reputation was very important. Though it wasn't exaggerated as a saying like perception was reality, it wasn't very far off. When a family grew as large as the Arundo, they actually entered quite a precarious state. They had so much territory to govern, rule and, most importantly, protect. In such a situation, their soft skills became far more important than how large their fists were. Even the Luxnix family experienced such a thing, or else they wouldn't have gone into such a state of hibernation for 3 generations. To make a complicated matter simple, the stronger your front as a family, the more battles you could avoid because those far weaker than you would know not to waste your time. Visit. For a better user experience, as an example, take the Arundo's territory. They might very well have dozens of much smaller families surrounding them. Under normal circumstances, due to the prestige the Arundo family had built up, these lesser families would never deign to attack them. The reality was that even if these families did all attack at once, the Arundo would still be able to deal with them. But such a thing would result in the Arundo stalling their growth phase and wasting resources. The sturdier front a family put up, the less they would have to deal with such things. It was in the same way a chess grandmaster would know to resign when a game reached a certain point because they had trust that their opponent would be able to close out the game properly. If the prestige of the Arundo family took a hit, though, and people began to believe they lacked the skill to close out the game, it would begin to breed trouble. The operative word was deterrence. Only with strong enough deterrence could a family occupy large amounts of territory while withstanding the least amount of pressure. Of course, the youth who spoke was one of the Arundo family's 2 candidates for their crown heir position, Isaac. Much like the others of the Arundo, he too was a bowman, and, unsurprisingly, he felt that his performance in these selections would decide whether he became the crown heir or not. We don't know who they are, but there are some rumors. Visit. For a better user experience, another youth of the Arundo family rubbed his nose. He had quite a mischievous streak between his eyes as he seemed amused that Isaac wasn't as well informed as he was. Of course, the only person who dared to do this was Isaac's rival for crown heir, Isaac. Stop beating around the bush, this matter involves us both. I don't know about you, but I have no intention of inheriting a laughingstock of a family. Isaac snorted, clearly not enjoying his distant cousin's lack of a sense of humor. It had always been this way. Isaac was the more social of the two, and though he was slightly less powerful, he had the far better social network. On the other hand, Isaac was the stronger one, something Isaac accepted, but he lacked the skills a patriarch should have. He didn't know how to speak to people or manage people, he didn't even know about something so important happening. This said, the relationship between the two wasn't so bad. Not every crown heir duo or trio was at each other's throats like Richard and Greatear had been. Though that was also because Isaac was quite easygoing while Isaac was quite simple-minded. Still, Isaac was right on this one. They were indeed a united front on this matter. There was news that came a few days ago that there was a huge commotion that went down at the Luxnix estate. There were even reports that a pillar of light was viewable from outer space. There's been a muddying of the details, but it seems to all revolve around one name, Lionel Morales. Visit. For a better user experience, huh? Isaac didn't seem to understand. Isaac rolled his eyes. Lionel Morales, the name of the boy the Luxnix had stricken from their family records. There were even rumors resurfacing about him in the last few months. I thought it was just some political scheme to deal with the Luxnix, but it seems there were rumors because he's back. Isaac's gaze narrowed. What is that supposed to mean? We can't get revenge because he's a Luxnix? Isaac was at a loss for words. What is in that head of yours? Didn't I just say his name was stricken from the records and that there was a huge commotion caused at the family? And didn't you see that the Luxnix arrived but he wasn't among them? I'm thinking that they only got such good seating arrangements because of that granny over there. It seems his grandmother was one of the Luxnix family elders before they broke off from the family. So he's free game. In fact, they're all free game. The light in both potential heirs' eyes lit up, murderous intent pervading from them. They might have been two opposing individuals, but they stood on the same side when it came to what they wanted for their Arundo family. At that moment, the billboard of motes of light had already shifted once more. Those that had failed had their names completely erased while a new set of individuals was highlighted. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. It seems like it's my turn. Alina nervously stood, walking toward the arena under the encouragement of the other people of the moon. Chapter 1156. Alina fluttered onto the stage with her heart nearly beating out of her chest. She seemed quite delicate and frail despite her more than average height for a woman. But this was just an unfortunate part of being born and raised on the moon. Her bone structure was more fragile than normal and she had to compensate with her use of force. Luckily, thanks to the metamorphosis, a lot of her deficits had been made up for. But at the moment she was at yet another great disadvantage. Of the forces, water elemental force was probably the most fickle. The density of it varied wildly depending on how close to a water source you were, how long it had been since the last time it rained, and what sort of climate there was. As a person whose most powerful tool was her water elemental ability, Alina today was much weaker than she had been on the ocean's surface that day. However, Elther's performance had given her courage. Who said she couldn't win just because she was weaker than those around her? Very quickly, all those called upon found their place in the ring. After the first battle, the nervous air was several times greater than it had been before. All those here were keenly aware that their lives might be forfeit at any time. Alina calmed herself, steadily accumulating the water force in her surroundings. Suddenly she felt several sharp gazes land on her, causing her brows to wrinkle. She looked up to find several individuals wielding bows looking right at her. It didn't take her a genius to realize why it was they were giving her such looks. Alina immediately went on the defensive. Begin. Visit. For a better user experience this time, the battle didn't start instantly. Wary eyes looked around, inching toward the edge of the arena to ensure that they couldn't be stabbed from behind. Unfortunately, some unlucky souls realized that they were surrounded from all sides and couldn't easily retreat. They kicked themselves for being so careless and stepping onto the platform so casually. This lull, though, only lasted for just a moment. On the sidelines, Lionel's brow knit. There were less Arundo family members in this bracket, just 3 compared to last time. However, if they insisted on targeting Alina like this, it would be a problem. Alina wasn't some spring flower. She had fought 2 wars and had been on the front line of the battle against Earth's oceanic creatures. The issue was that she was outclassed by Dimension Tier here and she was outnumbered. A low and delicate shout left Alina's lips, her accumulating water force erupting to form an enormous sphere of blue around her. She immediately surrounded the sphere with twin rivers of water, lashing out against the oncoming arrows. Bang, bang, bang. Alina's expression paled as she slid backward, large amounts of her water force dispersing. She quickly refocused her attention, diverting one portion toward the accumulation of more water force and another toward monitoring her surroundings. Alina knew that she had a weakness in movement technique, but she was very good at control. With this came a powerful internal sight, though not as exaggerated as one might expect to find with a Luxnix. Still, splitting her attention into two like this wasn't a problem. Unfortunately, what she quickly found was that her only enemy wasn't the Arundo. The Arundo were only one of the major families Elther had offended with his killing spree, and it was no secret to anyone in the arena that Alina was tied with him. Visit. For a better user experience, a youth approached Alina from the side, swinging toward her sphere of water. Alina reacted quickly. While it appeared to be a sphere, the reality was that a portion of it had sunk into the ground. Taking advantage of the cracks and the flexibility of water, Alina had set up a spiderweb trap of sorts in the ground around her. Unfortunately, she hadn't had enough time to make it as powerful as she could, but it would have to do for now. The youth was completely caught off guard, howling in pain as a spike of water force drilled through the sole of their feet. Having had their mind blinded by the torturous wound, the youth couldn't even react as a whip of water blasted them from the arena. At that split moment of Alina's attention being taken, though, several arrows had already appeared before her. Bang, bang, bang. Alina couldn't react in time to use her rivers, resulting in the arrows directly colliding with her sphere of protection. Panic colored her features as the arrows tore through, but her shield was just thick enough to slow the arrows to a crawl. They fell to the ground with dull clangs. However, Alina had been completely shaken. Of the 3 arrows, one had been aimed right for her forehead, another had been aimed right for her heart, and the last had been aimed right at her womb. Visit. For a better user experience, each was more sinister than the last, and it made her feel that her life had been sucked dry. By the time she realized her shield had been just barely enough to block them and she snapped out of it, she was horrified to find that several more attacks were coming her way. Another attack came from her left, this time wielding a glaive. Her right side, which she had just cleared, had already been filled by yet another. And right down her middle, a chorus of 3 more arrows sliced forward, right toward the holes in her water sphere that had yet to heal. And finish? Alina was at a loss for words. She had hardly been able to fight the battle she wanted to fight. She had just managed to drum up her courage to face these behemoths, but how had things ended this way? Maybe she wasn't one of the lucky ones after all. Fall off the stage. At that moment, Lionel's voice seemed to cut through all the noise. Like a pointed roar, it shook her psyche awake. Not everyone could remain calm in the face of death, and they might even forget solutions they could easily think of in any other situation. Alina had completely forgotten she was so close to the edge of the stage. But by the time she registered Lionel's words, it was too late. Even if she fell back now, those arrows wouldn't be stopped, they would still strike true. There was no way to survive this. Damn it. The latest _IP_SODs are on the website. If Alina could see through this in her flustered state, how could Lionel not? When he yelled out, he had already moved. However, it was then another booming voice descended. You dare? Orynyx's voice cast a shadow over the arena. Chapter 1157. Orynyx's expression was as dark as the night, fury marked between his brows. He hadn't thought that anyone would actually be so brazen as to interfere with the proceedings, especially after both he and especially Ganner had made it clear who held authority here and who didn't. Did he understand why Lionel was moving? Yes. Did he care about what that reason was? Absolutely not. Death was an inevitable part of these selections. There was a reason he hadn't done a single thing as Elther killed as he pleased. If anyone dared to try to stop Elther previously, he would have killed them on the spot. For Lionel to dare to do something like this before him? He was courting death. Lionel, however, had a vastly different perspective. He didn't care about the prestige of the Void Palace, nor did he care about Orynyx's authority. All he cared about was the fact that Alina was a woman who had put her life on the line to save his brothers just several weeks ago. If he stood by and did nothing as she died, he wouldn't even be able to look the people of the moon in the eye. Lionel didn't want to put his grandmother in a situation where she had to take action. His movement and her movement held completely different weights. He was still a member of the younger generation and his actions could be left as a slight against Orynyx himself. However, if his grandmother made a move, it wouldn't be a matter of youths any longer, it would be a slap to the face of the Void Palace itself. Among the geniuses of Earth, Lionel knew that he was the only one with the speed to make it. So he took it upon himself. However, The moment Orinik spoke, an oppressive aura fell like a hammer. It crashed against Lionel's head and threatened to bury him into the earth. The difference in this aura from what Lionel had experienced before in the past was like night and day. Even Sparking Star Order had no ability to match it. Visit. For the best no_underscore_understreet experience right then, though, Lionel's gaze flashed with a blinding violet light, a deep crimson hidden within suddenly lashing out and causing Orinik's aura to splinter like shards of glass. Lionel's body flickered with bronze runes, his figure stepping through space and appearing by Alina's side and within her water sphere in the blink of an eye. Wrapping an arm around her waist, he stepped and pulled backward, his free hand tapping forward 3 times in quick succession. His arm moved so quickly that it left afterimages in the air, almost making it seem like he had 4 arms instead of just 2. Clang, clang, clang. The arrows deflected off of Lionel's fingers like they had rammed into a metal wall, causing even Lionel to raise a brow. His bronze runes had already vanished as he had only needed to activate them for a moment to boost his spatial affinity for an instant, but he was surprised by the strength of his body. In fact, now that he thought about it, he had miscalculated the amount of effort he would need to get here as well. With soft steps, Lionel landed with Alina by his side, splashes of water landing around them as Alina looked around shaken, her face as pale as a sheet of paper. "Are you all right?" Lionel's brow furrowed, looking toward Alina. Yes, I'm all right. Visit. For a better user experience, Alina's voice trembled. She had faced death before, especially during her fight with the 3 whales. But never had it felt so close until now. It wasn't just that she faced death, it really felt like she had died for a moment. The entire arena seemed to freeze over as Orinik's gaze locked onto Lionel. The battle on the stage came to a grinding halt, no one certain of what to do any longer. At that moment, a torrent of boos rang down from the crowd above. They all felt they were rightfully pissed. It was fine when Elther killed people, but not when others wanted to kill Alina? Was there anything so good in this world? Do you treat my words as air? Lionel, who had been making sure that Alina was all right, only now turned toward Orinik. "And what words are those?" Lionel asked. Clearly not expecting to receive such an answer, Orinik's expression became fiercer. Ganner, who had been lazily reclining on his own chair, leaned his head on his palm, opening his eyes to reveal a gaze as sharp as a blade. "Do you think this is your playground and you can do as you please?" Visit. For the best experience, how did I do as I pleased? I saved a friend of mine, so just disqualify her and continue with the round. I've done nothing to interfere with your process, nor did I take out anyone who didn't deserve to be taken out. So it's fine for your people to kill others, but they can't be killed themselves. Orinik hadn't expected to get into a shouting match with a junior. In fact, he would have already acted had it not been for the fact he knew that Lionel's grandmother would never allow him to die. Orinik didn't fear the elder, but without knowing where his own superior was, he would rather not put his life on the line to fight this battle. If he died and the Void Palace only punished them afterward, it wouldn't be worth it. First of all, I never stopped anyone else from trying to save their people, they can only blame themselves for being too slow. Secondly, weren't you the one who said there was no such thing as absolute fairness? My friend has lost and won't receive a position to enter the Void Palace. Does that mean she also has to die? Is that how your Void Palace proves how macho they are? By forcing people who don't have to die to do so? Ina, where are you going? Yuri, who was shocked by what was happening here, suddenly realized that Aina had stood. But Aina was headed away instead of toward the stage. Visit. For a better user experience, I don't know, I don't like this. I'll be back when it's my turn. Her voice was just as unmoving and lacking in substance as it had been for the past several months. Chapter 1158. Yuri and Savon looked toward one another. The stress between their brows was almost too obvious for all to see. It felt like they were a pair of mothers trying to care for their child, but the problem was that this child had the strength to flatten a mountain with a single stomp of her feet. Was it jealousy? Maybe it was a bit of that. But, from what Yuri and Savon understood about the situation, it was very likely that Aina was seeing something beyond that, something that she simply hated to see. Once again, Lionel was putting himself at risk for the sake of saving someone else. How many times had she already seen something like this? The trouble here, though, was the fact that they weren't sure what this meant for Aina's personality. Was it returning? Or was it a childlike temper tantrum triggered by something unknown? It was simply too hard to tell, and this wasn't exactly a situation where they would be able to tell either. The two worriedly looked toward Lionel. Even if it wasn't for Aina, they wouldn't want to see Lionel die here. But if he really did die, who knew how it would affect Aina? Hearing the clear taunt in Lionel's words, Ornic's fury was at risk of tipping completely over. Leave it be. The sudden voice was like trickling rainwater, delicate and echoing. It was soothing to an almost impossible degree, and yet it washed over the arena with a momentum that made many freeze. The power behind it was so undeniable that no one seemed to even think of imagining the kind of beauty behind these words. Just the thought alone felt blasphemous. It was suddenly obvious to everyone present that Orinik, Ganner and the others were only the face of what the Void Palace had presented. The true Brawn hadn't bothered to appear. Maybe precisely because they were unworthy. Visit. For the best no understanding experience, the only one who furrowed his brows at this voice was Lionel. There was something odd and artificial about it. Though the voice sounded beautiful, he was of the opinion that it would sound even better if it wasn't so strained. Of course, he had no idea that his mother had changed the pitch of her voice slightly in the off chance that Lionel would recognize it. It seemed that she was right to be so cautious. Maybe only Lionel would be sharp enough to parse apart the difference. Lionel recovered quite quickly and nodded in thanks to seemingly empty air. Only after this did he lead Alina away and allow the rest of the second round to continue. Quite expectedly, no one dared to replicate what Lionel had done. The voice of the woman was like an imprint on their soul. She might have forgiven such a thing once, but who was to say that she would do so again? You didn't manage to stop him? Ganner looked toward Orinik, who had returned to their seating arrangements. The truth was that if Orinik had been standing near the stage, Lionel would have never been able to save Alina, at least not in time. However, because he hadn't seen much of a point in forcing himself to stand for the entirety of this day, he chose to return and sit, allowing the billboard to handle everything else. Unfortunately, this put him on the opposite side of the arena to where Lionel had come from, so he could only use his aura. He had thought it would be enough, but he couldn't have possibly expected that Lionel would be able to ignore it. Orinik's expression darkened, but he didn't give an answer. Ganner's lazy gaze had likewise become quite sharp. Despite his usual demeanor, he took his role in the Void Palace quite seriously as well. If not for their overseer saying something, they would have acted as well. It won't happen again. I didn't expect someone to actually be so brazen. Next time I will attack directly. Visit. For a better user experience, Orinik had wanted to disqualify Lionel and strip him of the right to participate, but after their overseer spoke, he would be looking down on her if he continued to pursue the matter. However, he would remember this. Why do you look so down? Lionel smiled. He patted Alina on the head, but she continued to look down at the ground. Unshed tears threatened to spill over. If she wasn't scared about being an even greater burden by crying, maybe she would have already failed to hold them back. Lionel sighed. We can't win everything. Even though you failed this time, won't there be a next time? Alina's shoulders trembled. She looked up to find Lionel's kind smile. Next time? Of course. Lionel reassured. Isn't the only requirement that you be below the 6th dimension? Right now you're only at tier 2. Between now and the next cycle, how much will you grow? By then, who will be able to stop you? Hearing such words, Alina suddenly felt a lot better. She didn't want to be left behind by everyone else. Which of them here didn't have their own personal battle to fight? Her small hands closed into fists. 2 single streaks of tears fell down her cheeks as she forced a smile. Visit. For the best no understanding experience, yes, next time, she said resolutely. When the two made it back, Alina was immediately smothered by Joyce. As scared as Alina was to die, for a moment Joyce really thought she had lost her longtime friend. The two cried in each other's arms for a long while. Lionel took a deep breath, sitting by his grandmother's side. Grandma, am I too reckless? Lionel suddenly asked. Yes, definitely. Lionel smiled bitterly when he heard these words. But he knew she was right. The trouble was, if he wasn't reckless, then who would be? There were certain things he couldn't just sit idly by and watch. These were his comrades and brothers and sisters in arms. He couldn't just let them die when he knew he could do something. Unfortunately, he knew that his actions had only painted an even larger target on the backs of the geniuses of Earth. One after another, the rounds passed by. Numerous so-called geniuses of Earth went up, but not a single one managed to pass. More coming later. Visit. For a better user experience. Chapter 1159. Lionel sat in silence as he watched his friends lose one after another, realizing that he was quite helpless to do anything about it. In truth, he blamed himself. He spent so long away from all of them that he never truly helped them to grow like he should have. He buried his head away, chasing a woman he couldn't even explain his attraction to and leaving them to fend against the dimensional verse on their own. He spoke of helping people, but he couldn't even properly help those closest to him. In fact, he had only made things harder on them. The mountain they would have had to climb to earn a spot to enter the Void Palace was tall to begin with, but now with this target painted onto their backs and their number disparity, an improbable cause had instantly become an impossible one. There was not the slightest hint of remorse. Without fail, the geniuses of Earth were the first to be cut down every time. If not for Lionel wising up and giving them some protection before they went up, it was likely that each one would have died. Lionel's brothers didn't fare any better than the rest. They too found themselves on the losing end of their battles. Fuck. Franco kicked his chair over. It flew out with such speed that it shattered into wood splinters the instant it hit a wall. But that didn't seem to make him feel any better. Visit. For a better user experience, losing wasn't something Lionel and his brothers were used to. They had been a team for so long and could count on two hands the number of games they had lost in that more than decade span. Yet each one of them, no matter how far apart they were, hit just as bad. There was a heavy silence, a fury, a subtle feeling of inadequacy. All the confidence Elther had helped them build up deflated like a balloon. A gloominess that Lionel didn't know how to fix took hold, but with it came an underlying determination. Lionel knew well how his brothers responded to adversity. Giving them words of encouragement now would only undermine and insult them. He was certain that this sort of humiliation wasn't something that would happen again, at least not for a very long time. The billboard flickered once more, and this time Noah stood, his gaze having long since turned from indifferent to cold. His gaze shifted over and met Lionel's. Though the two didn't exchange any words, their meaning was already clear. Noah's crystalline blue saber appeared long before he made it to the stage. His steps were even and measured while the sun seemed to dance off the edge of his blade. Every reflective light seemed to make those that saw it reflexively recoil, worried that one of these sharp rays might slice their neck clean off. Among those that had failed already, Jessica was among them. Her beast-taming ability was useless against these enemies as her pets were simply too weak and hadn't grown. On top of that, the wilderness of planet Luxnix was far too dangerous for even Lionel to travel through casually, let alone her. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience without a choice, she chose to not even summon her partners, resulting in her losing even faster than the others before her had. Though she returned gracefully and unwounded, without the same gloominess the others seemed to display, every time Noah sent a glance toward her he only seemed to become more infuriated. Jessica wasn't weak, nor were her beast partners. The reason she didn't dare to summon them was because she knew well that she would be ganged up on. It simply wasn't worth risking the help of her pets just to lose anyway, for as long as Noah could remember, Jessica had always followed by his side, a silent help and a right-hand woman that was simply irreplaceable. He had long since learned how to read the different shades of her placid expression. She looked indifferent now, but everything from the sway of her short-cut hair to the way she crossed her legs screamed to Noah that she was feeling sadness and guilt to the depths of her soul. Sadness because she had failed. Guilt because she couldn't follow in his steps. And it was all the fault of these people. Oh, another one of you? Are you all still stepping up to get embarrassed? Visit. For the best no_vel_understreet_understreet experience, Noah slowly walked up the steps of the arena, seemingly having not heard the jeers of the Montex family member. His steps were silent and his blade lightly bobbed just above the hard stone flooring. Everything from his breathing to the beat of his heart was steady. Begin. Ornik's voice still fell indifferently. He didn't originally care enough about these proceedings to become invested, but he still found himself watching every time a person of Earth stood up. He told himself that this was to ensure that Lionel could never interfere again, but if he was honest with him, he got a sick sort of satisfaction watching them be wiped out one after another. The instant his voice fell this time, though, he felt that something was different. Bang. It was a sound the audience had heard many times before. But this time, it was so strong and cacophonous that the sturdy stone platform themselves shattered, sprinkling into the air like shards of glass. Each one of Noah's steps were heavy and there was nothing remotely elegant about his movement. His body grew to 3 meters in height, his saber became as large as a door and his skin shimmered like diamond beneath the sunlight. He was like a rampaging titan, his limbs becoming like locomotives, crushing everything in his path. The latest _p_sodies are on the website. The soles of his feet shattered skulls, his blade bisected bodies, his fists crushed souls. Every heart-rending cry and spine-tingling snap of the bone resounded through the arena, painting a sensory image that would never be forgotten by those who witnessed it. Chapter 1160. Noah heavily stepped off of the stage, his body drenched in blood from head to toe, none of which was his own. The arena couldn't help but be silent outside of his heavy step. When Noah returned, Rosia stood with a doting expression on her face. She couldn't help but start wiping Noah off. Seeing how nonchalantly his grandmother was treating so much blood, Lionel suddenly got the feeling that maybe his family wasn't so normal. The dichotomy of sweet, old grandmother, helping her grandson wipe down the lifeblood of his murder victims. Just what kind of world was he in right now? Lionel's lip curled into a smile. Though the gloominess hadn't vanished, he could feel that Noah had vented much of their frustration. There was only so much that Lionel could do himself. At some point them witnessing his own success wouldn't move the needle anymore. However, seeing someone else do it, it gave them more courage to believe that they could do the same. Though the geniuses of Earth continued to lose after this, and even more miserably at that because Noah had re-energized their enemies, they still returned with their heads held high and a fire lit within their gaze. None of these people knew that the Lionel and his friends had only just experienced their metamorphosis not even half a decade ago. To have already reached such a stage in a short period of time was something to be proud of. And there'd come a day where they wouldn't have to show pride in their defeat, but could instead do so in their victory. The events of the day continued to wane. Of the people of Earth, most had already gone up and lost, unfortunately falling short. The latest _p_sodies are on the website. However, there were some success stories nonetheless. Carolus, the preeminent genius of the moon and a young man Lionel knew for his exceptionally high spatial affinity, managed to become the third person of Earth to claim their spot for the second day. His ability was devastating and one couldn't even approach him without fearing for their lives. Despite the fervor Noah had reignited, he still managed to weather the storm and claim his place. The next success story was more so of luck than of skill. But it was one that Lionel happily accepted nonetheless. Milan and Arnold were lucky enough to get drawn into the same group. Working together, Milan's defensive energy shield ability and Arnold's explosive palm ability, not to mention the latter's grasp of universal force, was the perfect tandem. What Lionel didn't notice was that Orinic's pupils had constricted into pinholes when he saw Arnold's use of universal force. It had to be remembered that originally, Arnold followed the same path of comprehending universal force as everyone else. He fused it with his palm force and made it one-dimensional. However, after his meeting with Lionel and the others, Lionel pointed him toward the more complete path of universal force after seeing his talent in it. Now, Arnold walked the same path of universal force that Lionel did, it was just that neither of them seemed to realize just how impossibly rare this path was. But Orinic, Ganner, and the other envoys of the Void Palace most certainly did. In fact, they had all but decided who would get the golden token after seeing this display visit. For a better user experience time continued to speed by. Unfortunately, outside of Elther, Noah, Carolus, Milan and Arnold, no others made it. Compared to the accumulating numbers of the other families, it was quite pitiful. However, it wasn't terrible either. Finally, after dozens of rounds and thousands of participants, Lionel felt a subtle connection call out to him as the billboard flickered. Lionel looked up, finding the number he had claimed for himself shimmering brightly. It seems like it was finally his turn. With a light push off his chair, Lionel stood and stretched, his bones cracking. His mind and body both felt quite alert. After sleeping for over a month, he felt more energized now than he had in a long time. Almost the instant Lionel rose, many eyes fell onto him. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that ever since that incident of a few hours ago, many had been waiting for Lionel's turn. The skill he had displayed in that short time frame wasn't small, but it was still difficult for many to get a read on exactly what his limits were. This was mostly because by the time people realized that someone actually had the audacity to move against the wishes of the Void Palace envoys, Lionel was already more than halfway there. It was hard to tell if he was just that fast, or if he had just reacted long before anyone else had. But now, all of those questions would be answered. The people of Earth had been being targeted by proxy only because they couldn't get at Lionel. But now that he was here, Lionel's steps were a lot lighter than Noah's despite the both of them being extremely heavy. He landed softly, his bare feet feeling the cool surface of the hard stone. Visit. For a better user experience comparatively speaking, Lionel was very casually dressed. He didn't have a weapon in hand nor did he wear any armor. He wore a loose-fitting pair of sweatpants and a long-sleeved shirt that waved about in the wind, pulling against the toned silhouette of his torso. It was the kind of nonchalance that made those around him either furrow their brows or sneer. At that moment, the final contestant stepped forward, a curious glint in his eye. This young man was none other than Isaac, and his bow was already in hand. His piercing gaze landed on Lionel. As though a hawk, he scanned him up and down, the rest of his internal sight focused on his surroundings. This matter couldn't have been more perfect. Lionel and his people had slighted the Arundo. If Isaac defeated him, he would take a leg up on that distant cousin of his. But he was still a cautious person. One scheme after another began to play in his mind. Isaac thought he was clever and calculated, but Lionel's mind was so clear at the moment that he could even count the steps of every insect within a kilometer radius right this moment. Such obvious glances weren't something he would miss. A bow? I don't think I need to use one here though. Lionel thought to himself. Why don't we test out a few things instead? Lionel stood in the dead center of the arena, seemingly oblivious to the danger of his position. Begin. Visit. For a better user experience. Chapter 1161. Almost the instant Orynyx's words fell, Lionel was bombarded from all sides with a flurry of attacks. The people of the Luxnyx family narrowed their eyes. Too many of them hadn't seen Lionel fight previously, and many only caught the tail end of what had happened. However, while news was cut off from the outside, the elites of the Luxnyx were very well informed about what had happened that day. Right this moment, other than maybe Miguel, there wasn't a soul with Luxnyx blood who wasn't paying very close attention, and that went doubly so for the members of the Luxnyx who happened to be in the same group with Lionel. Lionel, though, felt as though his mind was working at speeds too fast for the world. For a moment he just stood there, watching as these attacks charged toward him frame by frame as though it was all in slow motion. Itchem. Lionel's hands slid into his pockets, his eyes slowly closing. Let's try. A strong surge of dream force coalesced around Lionel, his foot lightly tapping on the ground and causing a quickly expanding ring of dark gold to form. Bang, 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 bang. Lionel was buried. A cascade of never-ending attacks drowned his body in a flurry of force of all kinds. The clashing of opposing and synergizing of like elements made the explosion all the more volatile, the entire center of the arena imploding into a rain of stone, rock and billowing smoke. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. However, right at that moment, a mighty roar sounded. It carried with it such a violent momentum that the smoke and dust cleared, shooting out and dispersing in all directions to reveal an enormous 10-meter-tall dark gold bear. Lionel stood leisurely on his bear construct's shoulders, unmoved and unfazed by what had happened around him. The bombardment of force sometimes rebounded and was sometimes swallowed by the thick fur and skin of the dark gold bear. Even its roar alone caused a rain of arrows to shatter and fly off like broken kites in the sky, leaving those who were left to witness it all speechless. Lionel looked down at his bear construct. Not bad, it was quite interesting. Compared to more static defensive mage arts, this bear was a bit special. It carried with it the elasticity unique to a living being, making it so that the rebound of attacks was less grating on Lionel. At the same time, its maneuverability in battle was several levels higher as well. Aimed for him. Seeing Lionel standing on the shoulder of such an enormous bear shook many to their core. How could they not recognize the Luxnyx force art system? But they had never seen a Luxnyx complete such a complex construct so quickly. That said, they knew the weaknesses of the Luxnyx force art system. More complex didn't always mean better. Lionel's bear construct swiped a paw at the air, standing high on its hind legs as another billowing roar left its lips. But its speed was too slow and many made it through, aiming right for Lionel. Lionel, though, seemed unmoved by this turn of events, his gaze glowing with a delicate pale violet light. He let out a slow breath, but the heat that came with it was so scorching that sparks of fire force lit in the air. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. Those sparks erupted, forming miniature flames about Lionel, all for the high-pitched tweeting of birds to pierce the souls of all those who heard it. In one moment, Lionel was completely unprotected. In the next, dozens of hummingbirds with wings flapping so quickly they left nothing more than a blur in their wake appeared. They shot forward like guided missiles, piercing through the flurry of attacks aimed for Lionel with a spine-tingling precision and burning them up from the inside out. Boom, 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 boom. Like kamikaze bombers, they crashed into the stone platform below, causing concentrated blasts of fire to erupt in all directions. Lionel stood on the shoulder of his bear construct, orchestrating the disaster. He never removed his hands from his pockets. In fact, he hadn't even moved a single inch since the battle began. One after another, he quick cast devastating arts, causing screams of agony and horror to echo endlessly. Isaac's pupils constricted. He had already organized several attacks, but none of them worked. Lionel seemed to see and plan out several steps ahead, and his casting speed was so fast that even if by some miracle you caught him off guard, it might not even matter. I'll do it myself. Isaac's gaze flashed, flipping his palm over to reveal a sleek arrow decorated from tip to tip in a complex array of runes. His gaze looked up, his force surging. Lionel's bear construct stamped a foot down, causing a ripple of earth to surge out in all directions, but Lionel himself remained unmoved. Visit. For a better user experience die. A blinding streak of silver shot through the skies. In the blink of an eye, it appeared just 3 meters from the side of Lionel's head. It was so fast that the bear construct couldn't possibly react in time. In fact, it was still stamping its feet, sending young geniuses sprawling and tumbling to the floor. Might be an interesting application of radiant force like this. Just when it seemed that Lionel would be pierced through, a blinding light appeared on his shoulder. Isaac barely had time to register the fact that this light had taken the shape of a silver bat before a shocking screech forced him to cover his ears. The bat's sonar sent ripples of concentric circles spiraling through the air, each rippled steadily getting larger. Isaac's arrow suddenly froze in the air, an astonishing pulse of magnetism stopping its ability to move forward any further. Then it shattered completely, crumbling into little pieces as it fell from the sky. Unfortunately for Isaac, the ripples of sonar didn't stop. The high-pitched screech tunneled its way forward, crashing into Isaac in what felt like the blink of an eye. He thought that he would fly backward upon impact, but what actually happened made his eyes bleed as they reflected despair. Isaac. The latest _AP_SODIES are on _the website. Bang. Isaac imploded, falling in a shower of blood, guts and gore. Chapter 1162. The members of the Arundo family all shot up. Even though this wasn't the first time a member of the Arundo family had died since this tournament began, it was most definitely the first time someone so high-profile had. Isaac's blood vessels threatened to shatter and pop. If not for several members of the Arundo dog piling him to force him down and back, there was no doubt that he would have already sprung into action, his full fury on display. Isaac tried his best to fight those that were on him off, but he was a bowman, not a Hulk. With so many having come together to stop him, and without him having the desire to kill them at all costs, he found his body almost buried into the ground. He could barely tilt his head up slightly, freeing just a single eye to focus on Lionel for all that he was worth. The white of his gaze pulsed with so many vessels that it practically turned red and rabid, his body trembling completely out of his control. But, in the end, he could only watch as Lionel's beast constructs vanished into motes of light, the entire arena empty of participants outside of himself. A pregnant silence took hold of the arena. There had been many battles before this, but none were ended nearly as easily as Lionel's own. They had thought that they might learn something about his speed from observing, when the reality was that Lionel didn't even have to move a single inch. The gap was so large that it felt like they had just watched an adult bully children. The Luxnix Star Order elders narrowed their gazes, watching Lionel walk away. They too hadn't witnessed the fight between Elodie and Lionel, but from what they knew, it lasted several exchanges and was quite heated, even though Lionel won in the end. The latest _AP_SODIES are on _the website. With that bit of information, they had of course concluded that Miguel would win easily. The gap between Miguel and the 3 armheads was so large that it might as well have been night and day. Seeing Lionel fight now, there wasn't anything he had just done that Elodie couldn't. Well, Elodie couldn't quick cast in such a fashion, but their meaning was that he would have won just as easily. Seeing Lionel's talent in action made them wonder just how far he could go. Lionel returned to the group with a light smile on his face. "You're such a show-off, Cap," Milan laughed. "Is that jealousy I hear?" Lionel's ears perked up. "Fuck you." Milan dove forward and tackled Lionel, but he found his arms swinging at air. By the time he noticed Lionel jumped over him, it was far too late. He crashed into the ground, skidding for a few meters. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. An eruption of laughter filled Earth's seething space. However, seeing the cheeriness of their atmosphere only made the fury smoldering within Isaac's soul burn even brighter. He had never felt so much rage in his life. But he had already had his turn and didn't even have anywhere to vent it. "Let me go. I'm leaving." Isaac's voice seemed to have dropped several octaves. Only after the others were certain that he was, indeed, leaving the arena did the rest of the Arundo relax. Amidst the Arundo elders, their patriarch sat with a stoic expression, watching as Isaac turned and left. It was impossible to tell what he was thinking by just his facial features alone, but he didn't seem to have reacted to Isaac's death at all. Inwardly, though, he felt that this was a turning point for his family. If Isaac could climb this mountain, maybe it would be exactly what his Arundo family needed to cross that final barrier and grow to match those three-pillar families. The events continued. By the time the end of the day began to roll around, countless geniuses had gone up. When it was Miguel's turn, one might have thought that he hadn't stepped onto the stage at all. Everyone ran around him as though they had blinders on, refusing to even think of attacking him. For a better user experience, Miguel stood in silence, not bothering to make a move either. When just 3 individuals remained, he casually stepped off of the platform without a care in the world. The Luxnick's arm heads received the same treatment. By coincidence, the equivalent geniuses of the 3 leading families didn't meet, so their rounds ended just as easily and without fanfare. The likes of Savon and Yuri, surprisingly, or maybe not so surprisingly, also gained a spot for themselves. Savon was a talent of Earth and had been able to adapt on planet Viola for far longer than the others had, so her success wasn't too much to accept. As for Yuri, she was of mysterious origins to begin with and had always had more power than she displayed. Even after claiming a spot, she hadn't seemed to have gone all out. The Montex and Viola geniuses, of course, performed just as well. Though their deterrence wasn't as great as Miguel, they still received their due respect. Richard was among those that passed, only having to exchange 1 to 2 blows to properly display his might and prowess. Richard couldn't help but frown lightly when he stepped off of the platform when he looked toward where Aina should have been, she was absolutely nowhere to be seen. However, he turned his head away not long afterward. After giving up so much to earn a spot, he doubted that she would miss out on her chance. Finally, the day waned and the billboard flickered for the final time, its motes of light forming around the last list of names. As though a ghost, Aina appeared once more. When she stepped out and toward the arena, the crowd itself seemed to suck in a cold breath all at once. For a better user experience, this level of beauty? Was it even meant to be a part of their world? Chapter 1163. The current Aina didn't have the presence of maturity and elegance that a woman slowly reaching her prime should have. Her current mindset was quite infantile and she still hadn't quite grasped concepts of her own feminine wiles and charms. In addition, she had already learned to perfectly control her own mental coercion. After the shackles on her talent were released, she improved by leaps and bounds every day. And yet, none of it seemed to matter. For those here, this was the greatest beauty they had ever laid eyes on. Despite her indifference to the world, it only added to her charms, making her seem as though she had descended from another world entirely. The current Aina wore a flexible armor that wrapped around her curves almost too well, an enormous battle axe of red gold hovering to her back. Her every step carried its own explosive power, and the depth of black her armor and hair shared seemed to give her the tinge of a devilish vibe. Lionel fell into silence when his gaze landed on her again for the second time in a month. His expression didn't flicker and his arms remained crossed about his chest. He could tell with a single glance that she had improved vastly since he last saw her. Even after all his own improvements, he had next to no certainty of defeating her. In fact, he faintly felt that he might very well lose. It was a surprising conclusion for Lionel to come to, but it hardly moved the needle for him one way or another. After a month of rest, Lionel felt that he finally understood what bothered him so much about all of this. Objectively, he knew how he had hurt Aina. She was in a vulnerable point in her life and she was heavily reliant on him. That moment hadn't been the first time she got mad at him for risking his life for the sake of others. He had lost count of the number of times she had insisted that he should put himself first. For a better user experience, he and Aina had been clashing in this way even long before they made their relationship official. That day, when Lionel excitedly left the Mayan zone, eager to see her again, and she pierced a hand through Conrad's heart. Lionel knew that that had been her way of waking him up to reality. Not only was she not solely that shy and timid girl he had known, but she was precisely the kind of cold-blooded murderer Lionel himself never wanted to become. Time and time again they faced this exact clash. Even in the Jones Zone, when Aina and he almost died because he was too soft with how he used his blade, even so far back they had always butted heads. Lionel knew this. He knew how she felt. So why had he reacted the way he had? The answer was so obvious that Lionel felt that he had been running away from it as opposed to chasing it like he should have been. All those years, Lionel had always been chasing after Aina, always doing the things she wanted, how she wanted to do them. He never batted an eye, never complained, and always followed along, happy just to be by her side. This wasn't a burden on him, and for him to pretend like it had been would be nothing more than revisionist history. He had been happy to do it. She was the woman he loved, the only woman he loved. To him, doing things for her wasn't a sacrifice, it was a pleasure, a privilege. However, when the day came that Lionel finally had something he wanted to fight for himself, a goal he wanted to aspire toward and chase, rather than receiving the same sort of support he had always given Aina, what he received in return was doubt and insecurity. When Lionel told Aina about his dreams, about how he wanted to unite the dimensional verse and have her by his side as his queen, he didn't receive the eagerness and support he had been expecting. Instead, he received a questioning that he would have expected from a stranger or a person who didn't care about what his own hopes and aspirations were. The latest _IP_SODIES are on _the website. He received the words of a person who didn't believe in him. That day when Aina left him, it was just more of the same. Lionel understood how she felt, he truly did. She had gone through so much trauma in her life and didn't deserve any more. But, in his eyes, the fundamental root of it all was that she didn't believe in him. When Lionel met an opponent that didn't believe in him, he would just defeat them. When he met an enemy that didn't believe in him, he would just kill them. When he met a mountain no one believed he could climb, he would ignore those who looked down on him and climb it anyway. The one fundamental truth about himself was that he absolutely hated to lose. Maybe why he was so good at following his father's mantras of respect and persistence was exactly because of this. This was such a core part of who he was that he excelled in everything he did, even when it was something he didn't like very much. Maybe this was Lionel's own brand of arrogance, that deep-seated belief in himself that couldn't accept the speculation and doubt of others. The question, though, was what would he to do when the person who didn't believe in him was someone he had given his heart to? How could he ignore her? How could he defeat her? How could he kill her? He didn't know the answer to that. So, visit. For a better user experience, he sat and watched as the love of his life wowed the crowd, her skills and movements breathing life into the world. He sat and watched as she cleared her group, easily claiming her spot with her back to him. He sat and watched as another man with a grin of pride on his face that should have been his own stepped before everyone, boisterously laughing as he pointed toward her. "I want to thank the Montex and Luxnix family for allowing me this stage." Richard's voice boomed. Now that today's event has ended and there will be a gap between today and the second day's rounds, I would like to make an announcement to everyone. 2 days from now, my and my fiancée Aina Brazinger will be getting married. I invite all those in attendance today to bear witness to the first day of the rest of our lives. A certain shift took place in the atmosphere. Feelings of awe, worship and envy took hold. To have such a woman as a wife. Just how lucky was this Viola family crown heir? Finally, Lionel stopped watching, his eyes closing in peace. He finally had his answer. Now he could let go. The latest _IP_SODIES are on _the website. Author's note. He'll have to ask you guys to trust me, this won't end like you think it will. If you want books that can subvert tropes, you have to give an author a chance first, LMAO. Anywho, the main purpose of this note is to tell you guys that my birthday is tomorrow, so I won't be uploading. We'll be back the day after. Love you guys, love. Chapter 1164. There was a stunned silence that overcame the earth region of the arena. However, it was for just a moment. In the next instant, a fiery pillar of rage suddenly erupted. "You bitch." Milan, Franco, Gil and Raj all charged forward as though they had lost their minds. Seemingly having expected this result, it was Joel, Arnold, Alan and Drake who leapt forward just a split moment afterward, diving for their waists and tackling them down. The 8 immediately ended up in a furious sort of dog pile. But, compared to the warmness such a thing had carried just a day ago, there was something decidedly sad about it this time around. It only seemed to make it worse that in all the commotion of the arena due to Richard's announcement, the commotion caused by these 8 was nothing more than a drop of water into a vast ocean. No one seemed to notice at all. No one except for Savon and Yuri, that is. Let me go. I held back enough. I'm going to tear them both a new asshole. Raj raged. Unfortunately, the clamp Arnold had on Raj was far too strong. He could hardly move and he didn't have the heart to use his ability on his brother. In the end, he could only squirm wildly, his gaze just as red as I-6 had been just hours ago. Rija's eyes flickered with confusion. She didn't quite understand what was going on. Visit. For the best no understanding experience, she looked toward her grandson, only to see that his eyes were closed. If she didn't know better, she would think that Lionel was having a nap. It was then that she pieced everything together. That day when she saw the pain in her grandson's eyes, hidden beneath his coldness and indifference, this Richard and that Aina had both been present. Could it be that it was related to this? Was that why he had been feeling that way on that day? Coming to this conclusion, Rija's gaze also lit with fury. The murderous intent coming from her rose like the tides of a tsunami, threatening to drown the arena out in waves. It would only be a moment before everyone's attention was drawn, but Joel, Arnold, Drake and Alan all looked back toward Lionel. Of Lionel's brothers there were 2 divisions. Raj, Milan, Gil and Franco had always been the jokesters. They had their own brand of humor, and if there was a joke being made, there was a 90% certainty that it was coming from one of them. On the other hand, Joel, Arnold, Drake and Alan were far more reserved. Joel was always the de facto leader of the group when Lionel wasn't present. Drake had meant to be Lionel's successor after he graduated from Royal Blue. Alan had an introverted personality, so much so that he didn't even show off his excellent physique, always wearing baggy clothing. And Arnold was a man of few words, even when he was communicating with Lionel himself. And yet, at that moment, they all looked toward Lionel with the same crimson gaze. Visit. For the best no_vil_underscored_g experience, so long as Lionel gave the signal, no matter how high the odds were stacked against them, no matter how subtle such a signal was, they would immediately release Raj, Milan, Gil and Franco. In fact, not only would they release them but they would be right alongside them, charging forth. To them, any slight against Lionel was a slight against them. They had been there before Lionel met Aina. They had been there before Lionel fell for her, before he spent years chasing after her. He had never shown any interest in any other woman. His admirers could have wrapped around Earth itself, yet he had never bat an eyelash. They had always believed that Aina wasn't worthy of Lionel. Even when she revealed herself to be a world-toppling beauty, she left soon after, leaving a bad taste in all of their mouths. Now they felt that things had gone too far. They found it difficult even to control themselves at this point. Lionel's eyes remained closed, his face the picture of serenity. In his mind, he had once again entered a world of white, a familiar balance standing before him. After everything, it had been perfectly balanced, no one side outweighing the other. He gazed upon it silently, going through all the memories it held once more. His body felt quite light and his mind felt extremely clear. His reflection on these memories made him feel as though he was right back there again, simulating that moment in real time without missing a single detail. The first day he met her, the first time he realized he liked her, the first time he confessed to her, the second time, the third. Visit. For the best no_vil_underscored_g experience, the time they spent in the Jones Zone, their battle against Royal Blue Fort, his rage-fueled tirade against the puppet master. Those final moments of peace they had together at Variant Heart Mountain. The last time they shared a bed together. They were memories enough to move a man to tears. Somehow, though, to Lionel it felt like he was watching the movie of someone else's life. He reached forward and touched the balance scale, his hand trailing down its frame before landing on the final object that had managed to keep it all even. It was a delicate, fragmented bracelet. It weighed almost nothing and was useless even to a third-dimensional existence. It was nothing more than a sentimental ornament, but it weighed so heavily. It was the final strand of hope that Lionel had been holding onto, so much so that his logical mind had given it more weight than even it was worth. Crack. With a light squeeze, Lionel crushed it to powder. He turned and walked away, the golden bronze balance crumbling into a pile of ash. In the real world, Lionel opened his eyes. A strong pressure seemed to roll out from him in waves, his mind suddenly feeling extraordinarily free. Visit. For the best no_underscored experience, he blinked, seeing the gazes of his brothers looking back at him. What are you all wrestling for? Take it easy on Milan and Arnold, they still need to fight in a few days. Lionel laughed lightly, his aura dispelling the tense atmosphere into the wind. Chapter 1165. Later that day, Lionel sat in silent meditation. He felt that everything about him was running smoother and faster than it ever had before. He could even feel his innate node far more clearly, so clearly, in fact, that he was shocked he hadn't sensed just how special it was before. His innate node wasn't just the source of a special force, it was more accurately the root of one. If Lionel had to describe it, he would say that an innate node was a step beyond a pure force crystal, maybe several steps, even. What this meant was that an innate node wasn't just a store of force, but it also carried with it the natural force arts one might expect to find in a pure force crystal. The difference was that an innate node's natural force arts were not only far more complete, they were far more layered and complex. Though Lionel had never laid eyes on a pure force crystal, at least not yet, he was absolutely certain of this. The depth of his innate force node was so vast that even he had a hard time believing it. He also came to understand that this was where the difference between himself and Elther lay. Elther had access to a force on the same level as Scarlet Star Force and Chaotic Particle Force. The difference was that this was Elther's ability granting him this affinity, whereas Lionel's own was an innate node. Lionel had thought that there wasn't much of a difference originally, just a different road to the same destination. But he realized now that there was a world of difference. Elther would never have access to the same depth of understanding Lionel could gain from his innate node. The world that opened up to Lionel was so large that he was having a hard time deciding where to start. Just to put matters into perspective, from only a cursory glance and look through, Lionel felt that he could build a visualization to aid his path through the fifth dimension, build a completely new magic system, comprehend derivative forces. The possibilities were endless. It felt like he had just been handed the blueprint of a vastly more advanced civilization, and now he could benefit by piecing together all of its mysteries. The change was so great that even Lionel was baffled for just a moment. In the past, he couldn't even send his internal sight near his innate node without it trying to destroy his mind. But now he didn't have to risk his mind at all. It was as though his innate node was directly speaking to him. Destruction. Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel couldn't have expected that releasing his own baggage would open himself up in this way. It was like the weight of Aina had been a blockage. Or maybe it was just the act of allowing those feelings to shatter that allowed Lionel to ascend his understanding to a new level. Fascinating. Lionel wondered, did Miguel have this same ability? Could he naturally feel what Lionel had? Or were there complications with the process? Lionel wasn't jealous, he was more so curious. Because if one innate node could bring him such benefits, what about another? He already had the little mink who could snatch abilities from others. He could use the silver tablet to wash away the personalities of those abilities to allow his people to absorb them without backlash. He had the tentacle womb, which he already had an evolution path for. If he also began to accumulate innate nodes as well, Lionel's gaze flickered. Maybe he didn't notice it, or maybe he did. But he didn't even consider what it would take for him to accumulate these innate nodes. Lionel raised a palm, his force flickering and surging. After forming his seventh star, he realized that he had gained the ability to replenish his innate node faster. Unfortunately, this was a fairly useless ability since his body couldn't even withstand using his innate node to begin with. Let alone draining it, he couldn't even use a single % of it. However, now, Lionel realized that his innate node was no longer entirely useless to him either. Visit. For the best no-understanding experience, the destructive aura that he had subtly grasped alone made his attacks far more potent than they had been in the past. And now that his senses toward his innate node were even sharper, his destructive aura would only grow. There may very well come a time where Lionel would only have to touch something to make it crumble from the outside in. His presence alone would cause things to disintegrate. Though the effect would be lesser than using Scarlet Star Force, it was a good replacement while he focused on getting his body stronger. The current Lionel sat outside, near the pool of the hotel. He was in full view of everyone around him, causing him to be the subject of quite a bit of scrutiny. However, no matter how many times they looked over at him, no one could find anything wrong. Is he really all right? Milan mumbled. The 8 of them, including Lionel's grandmother, were all furious. In fact, many of those who hadn't known the details previously were furious for Lionel as well. However, with the man himself acting as though nothing had happened, what were they supposed to do exactly? You know, Lionel, when he cuts something off, he doesn't even look back. Joel said lightly. Raj snorted. Good. It would be embarrassing if I had a harem and Leo didn't. This is the way it should be. He needs at least 3 wives and 12 concubines. I won't let him stop until he has at least that many. Our boy is about to have an elite fuckboy arc. The women of the group looked toward Raj with disdain, but they refrained from saying anything since it was clear that he was just sticking up for Lionel. However, Raj didn't seem ready to let it go. Visit. For the best no_vel_8_G experience, what are you all looking at? All you women are the same. How many men are you going to turn into the monsters you complain about before you realize that you're the problem? Joyce suddenly snapped, her fists lighting with force. Are you trying to fight it out, you sack of shit? Oh my, I'm so scared. Raj rolled his eyes. Come bite me. I can't for the life of me imagine why you're called the fairer sex. You're all little demons in skimpy clothing. You ever think that maybe the reason you're all so attracted to the hard exterior of a man is because you're all just as hard on the inside? Come on, come fight me then. At least in this kind of world you actually stand a chance. Joyce was so furious she couldn't even put her anger into words. Joel and the others felt a headache coming along. They knew the reason Raj was acting like this wasn't just related to Lionel. At that moment, though, Joel's brows suddenly furrowed, a message entering his ears. Joel immediately looked up to Lionel. He knew how sharp Lionel's senses were, there was no way he would miss such a thing. However, he didn't react in the slightest. It was either he was distracted by something, or he simply didn't care. Considering who it was, Joel had the feeling it was the latter. A few of you come with me, Joel said lightly before going off. Visit. For a better user experience. Chapter 1166. An odd silence reigned over the atmosphere in a forest just on the outskirts of a Luxnick city. Joel, Franco and Alan stood across from Yuri and Savon, the latter two wearing nervous, fidgeting expressions. In truth, Joel was quite surprised that Yuri had managed to contact them from so far away. It had taken several hours just to get here. If not for Joel being pretty level-headed, he wouldn't have even deemed to come. But, for matters related to Lionel, he was still willing to go so far. That said, it made sense. This was Planet Luxnix, not Planet Viola. Plus, the status of these two was ties to Miel and Aina, so even if it was Planet Viola, it wasn't like they could move about as freely as they wanted. Due to these reasons, they had no choice but to contact Joel and the others from so far away. The surprising part, though, was that Yuri was actually able to accomplish such a thing. It made Joel take her just that bit more seriously. Where is Lionel? Yuri finally asked, somewhat unwilling to meet their gazes. In fact, much of her fidgeting was because she was trying to see if Lionel was coming or not. Yuri had left a small tag on Joel's soul force the last time they met, but she had never been able to do the same with Lionel. So, she had contacted Joel, hoping to contact Lionel through him. But, Joel didn't seem to have come with Lionel at all. This was a problem. If Lionel was truly angry, this would make things even more difficult. Visit. For a better user experience, of course. This only showed how little Yuri understood about Lionel. Is he that angry? Joel, despite his usual calm disposition, couldn't help but narrow his eyes at these words. What did she mean, is he that angry? Setting aside the truth for a moment, so what if he was? Did he not have the right to be? The fact he hadn't exploded onto the arena stage was a proof of his self-control and nothing else. Joel reached out a hand and put it on Franco's chest, stopping him from snapping. Among the three who had come, Joel and Alan were quite level-headed, but Franco was most definitely not. Joel had made it a point not to take Raj along with them because he would only exacerbate any situation they ended up getting into, but the more rowdy of their group had insisted that at least one of them go because they didn't trust Joel and Alan to say the harsh things when they needed to be said. That said, they knew that this was a gross exaggeration. The current Joel and Alan were just as enraged as any one of them. Seeing the expressions of the three men before her, Yuri's own flickered, making her feel that maybe she had said something wrong. Your words show just how little you understand about Lionel, but that isn't your fault. You're just the friend of the woman he liked, not the woman herself. The one who deserves the blame is her. The latest _AP_SODIes are on _the website. Yuri's jaw clenched. Just the same way Raj was willing to go overboard in protecting Lionel, even saying many things he shouldn't have said, Yuri was much the same way with Aina. In fact, compared to the time Lionel's brothers had spent by his side, Yuri had been with Aina even longer. However, this time she took deep breaths, realizing that letting her temper flare like it had before would only be detrimental to her goal. You all have to understand that this matter isn't what it looks like. Joel's brow furrowed, but he chose to continue to listen instead of interjecting. The truth of the matter was that if Joel had told Lionel that Yuri wanted to talk, Lionel probably would have come. And even if Lionel chose not to come, it wouldn't be because he was furious, it would only be because he felt that his time was better applied to something else. Joel knew better than most that what Lionel was feeling right now wasn't rage, it was indifference. If he felt that his time was better spent training and meditating, he wouldn't come. If he was curious enough to hear what Yuri would say, then it would come. It was that simple. However, Joel knew well at the same time that there was a very lowly, maybe 0% probability, that Lionel would change his mind purely on what Yuri would say. Knowing this, Joel chose not to waste Lionel's time. The three of them already had been booted from the second day of competition, they had nothing to lose wasting time like this. So, he listened to Yuri's story from start to finish. The latest _p_sodies are on the website. So you mean to say that Aina's father agreed to this marriage for the sake of a position to enter the Void Palace selection? But this was a lie because anyone could participate anyway? Joel summarized. Yes. Yuri wrung her hands together. But they lied. The marriage was only supposed to take place after the selection, but Richard used a loophole in the agreement to place it after the first day of the selection. Also, the deal wasn't of equivalent exchange because there was no quota this year to begin with. Even Savon and I could participate. Joel, Alan and Franco watched in silence and Yuri continued to explain herself. They didn't interrupt her and didn't shift her gaze away. The only one of the two who seemed to realize that something was wrong with the atmosphere was Savon, who could only sigh inwardly. Yuri loved Aina too much. She was unwilling for Aina to take any sort of losses, even if others had to suffer for it. The same way Lionel's brothers thought that Aina was unworthy of him, just how much more so did Yuri believe the vice versa, albeit subconsciously? And what do you want us to do about this, exactly? Joel asked. We have to save her. I saw earlier that Lionel's grandmother is very powerful. If she works together with my adoptive father, can't we kidnap Aina before the wedding? A pregnant silence fell over the forest. Visit. For the best no understanding experience. So let me get this straight. Franco began to speak, this time not receiving the interruption of Joel. Your friend wanted to spread her legs for a chance to move up in the world, but now that she's been played, she wants everyone to risk their lives to save her from one of the strongest families in the sector? Did I get that right? Chapter 1167. Yuri was stunned for a moment before she suddenly imploded. What the hell did you just say? Bang. A violent invisible force shot out in all directions. The expressions of the three young men instantly changed as they hurried to protect themselves, but it was already too late. As though a wall of solid wind had hit them, they flew backward like an iron ball out of a cannon. In fact, it wasn't just them. The surrounding nature was completely flattened as though a fist had descended from the sky. The rippling waves spread outward like a fan, sending the three flying for dozens of meters. Yuri. Savon was shocked awake. Savon violently pulled Yuri backward, disrupting the eruption of her fury. Then she sprung forward at her fastest speed, her force reaching out to slow the blow the three had suffered. She barely made it in time to ensure that they didn't crash against the ground or any thick trees, however that didn't stop the three of them from coughing up blood. Savon had reacted far too slowly to stop the initial impact. The latest _p_sodies are on the website. Yuri was still furious enough to go for another attack. Unfortunately, Savon was standing in the path between herself and the three. Although she had plenty of methods of going around Savon, she had a feeling that being so close, Savon would definitely try to block her. Joel, Alan and Franco coughed out another mouthful of blood, their gazes lit with fury. Savon, get out of the way. Yuri yelled. This bitch. Franco growled, about to get up. Just when it seemed like things would truly get out of hand, Savon turned back toward Yuri, her gaze livid. For a moment, she seemed to return to that same fiery-tempered girl who always reprimanded Lionel for chasing after Aina. You've done enough. Step back. Savon's near roar shocked Yuri out of her own rage and even made Franco take a pause. He was already furious enough to go all out with this woman, but Savon's actions seemed to snap them all awake. Savon turned back toward the boys, kneeling down. She handed them all healing pills she had managed to accumulate, allowing their injuries to stabilize. Visit. For a better user experience, I'm sorry about Yuri, but she treats Aina like her own flesh and blood sister. She often says and does things she doesn't mean when it comes to her, but please hear me out. She didn't tell you the full scope of the truth and how things ended up this way. Savon. Yuri's expression changed. Yuri wasn't a fool. She didn't speak about those matters on purpose because the less people that knew, the better. Not only did it involve a treasure that Meal could be hunted down for, if Aina didn't interact with the world as normally as possible, it was possible that it would have adverse reactions on the reawakening of her personality. If it wasn't for the fact Savon was so close with Aina and would immediately realize that there was something wrong with her personality, she wouldn't have been told the truth of the circumstances either. Yuri had naively only ever seen things from her perspective. In her mind, Aina was perfect and everyone should treat her as such, not to mention care about her well-being just as much as she did. So, she had never considered telling them the full story because she didn't think it was necessary. Wasn't what she had said enough? Wasn't it clear as day that Aina had been wronged? Then how could they possibly act like it wasn't a big deal? How could they say such cruel words? What Yuri couldn't wrap her head around was something that Savon understood almost too intimately. It could be said that of all the people who understood best how Lionel felt right now, Savon was at the top of the list. Unlike Yuri, Savon had been thrust into this world just like Lionel had, forced to scratch and claw for everything and even barely surviving her first zone. And, just like Lionel, she had walked out to find her best friend of 4 years with her bloodied arm through a human's chest. That event had caused Savon to become estranged from Yuri and Aina. And yet, instead of trying to bring her back into the fold and support her in the moment she needed it the most, they both left her. Visit. For a better user experience, Aina left to go off on her adventures with Lionel, and Yuri only ever truly cared about Aina's well-being, not considering Savon very much at all. If Savon hadn't felt the need to step in during the argument between Lionel's brothers and Aina, maybe they would have all remained estranged for a lifetime. And what had happened after that? Well, the broken and fragile Aina collapsed in her arms, sobbing and crying her worries away, pining over a man she herself had chosen to leave. She brought Savon out like a crutch, even dragging her to this sixth-dimensional world so she could continue to be used. When Aina hadn't needed Savon anymore, she was fine with ignoring her existence. But, the moment she dragged her back into her life, forcing her to become a shoulder to cry on. Did Savon understand that Aina was a broken person? Yes. Did she understand that it wasn't entirely Aina's fault? Yes. Did she blame Aina and hate her like another might? No. However, none of this changed the fact that it hurt. No one ever considered her thoughts and her feelings. Despite having friends around, she felt like she was alone. She had spent 4 years protecting Aina, but she never received the same in return. There was no one else who understood how Lionel felt right this moment more than she did. But even now she was willing to help. Visit. For the best no_vel_understand experience, so she explained. The only details she missed were ones that she had never been privy to, but whether it was related to how broken Aina was after leaving Lionel, all the way up to her personality being completely erased, she left nothing out. When she was finished, the 3 young men looked toward one another. They hadn't expected to have had the needle moved for them at all. But now, what were they supposed to do? Chapter 1168. Joel took a deep breath. This changed the dynamic of a lot of things, but he wasn't sure of how to proceed from here. For one, the Viola family was far too powerful. The fact that they had moved the wedding up on purpose without regard for Meal meant that they were already determined to do this. It was clear that after the elders of the Viola family saw Aina's talent, they were determined to make her theirs. But this was just one aspect of it. Even if they had known this before, Franco would have still said what he said earlier. The fact that Aina wasn't entirely in control of her faculties, though, was something that made even them hesitate. The choice was made by Aina's father to begin with, not Aina. And it seemed that Aina agreed because she saw the logic behind it. Richard wasn't worth much to her before, but if he was a ticket to the Void Palace, then it made sense to her. As for matters of love, she hadn't even considered it. Joel shook his head. I don't know, I can't guarantee anything. I can only say that we'll speak with Lionel and Granny Roja. Maybe there is something they can do. Maybe if it had been before the first day's selection, Joel and the others would have been ready to wade through hell or high water, not for Aina, but just so that Lionel would have a chance at happiness. The odds a man would be able to get over his first love marrying and lying with another man was minimal at best. And, for someone like Lionel, just the attempt toward the action alone was enough for him to shut down and not mind it anymore. But, just earlier today they had all received a rude awakening. All the pride they had had from their accomplishments in the Milky Way flew away like dust in a storm. They were nothing but ants here. They had barely gained the ability to fight against the geniuses of branch families. How could they possibly challenge the older generation of a pillar family like the Viola? Savon smiled a complicated smile. It had a hint of bitterness to it, but it was mostly filled with understanding. The latest _sodes are on the website. The truth was that Meal hadn't even sent them here. It was Yuri who realized that something must have gone wrong, causing her to come here of her own accord. She knew her adoptive father well and knew that he wouldn't put Aina in danger on purpose. He likely wanted to use Richard, and then when she was accepted by the Void Palace, throw him away. The trouble was that while Meal had spent most of his time training, pining after a day he could get revenge for his late wife, Richard had been embroiled in political schemes since he was a boy. How could Meal outsmart Richard? Richard saw through his plan with a glance and adjusted accordingly. Without the halo of Void Palace disciple around her, Richard had no need to worry about forcing Aina to do anything. And because he was alone and this marriage had been accepted by the elders of the Viola family, Meal couldn't snatch Aina away openly without being hunted down and killed. This left Meal with very little options and Aina with even fewer. Ultimately they were all at a loss for what to do. Yep. Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel smiled as little Blackstar raced around his hands, arms and shoulders, messing about with little Tali. The two still had their rivalry and it only seemed to grow stronger after little Blackstar awoke from his comatose state. Still, though they seemed to be at each other's throats, Lionel could faintly feel that little Tali had missed little Blackstar. The two little toddlers might as well have been the closest of blood brothers. Lionel was happy that he had his own brothers as well. Being an only child could have very well been too lonely if he hadn't. Ah, be careful, don't touch that. Little Blackstar almost nicked the blade of a sword Lionel was working on. One would have thought that Lionel would be honing his skill, maybe practicing some more of the Luxnix family force arts. But no. He was crafting. The sword looked like it was straight out of Grecian times. It was quite short, being only about 1.5 feet long. Its body was narrower near the hilt and thicker near its tip before ending at a point, giving it a sleek sort of S-shaped curve. It had a bronze blade and a delicate wood handle that was immaculately carved. But maybe its most astounding feature was that the air seemed to tremble around it, almost distorting reality everywhere it passed. The latest _sodes are on the website. Without Lionel even telling him, Blackstar suddenly sensed danger, rolling into a ball and vanishing into space before appearing high in the air. His beady black eyes looked down, his whiskers flickering between apprehension and curiosity. Little Blackstar didn't feel like he would die from that blade, but he definitely felt that he would get hurt. In fact, he felt that he would be hurt even if he used his incorporeal ability. Blackstar was used to being immune to most attacks because he could just displace his body into his shadow world. But, for some reason, that sword seemed to be able to ignore him, even attack him while he was in there. Lionel reached out and grabbed the sword, balancing it on a finger. It's just a prototype, but it's pretty good. Lionel spoke with little Blackstar. If I made weapons like this, it would be good. The problem is that this sort of blade can only last one battle before its own destructive capability eats away at the metal it was made from. A shame. I'm not sure if I could fix that, it would take quite some research. Yep. Lionel laughed. I can make you some claw gauntlets like this if you want. But they would probably have the same issue. Plus, don't you think you scare your enemies enough? Yep. The latest _sodes are on the website. Blackstar shook his head furiously. Clearly the little guy wasn't satisfied. Chapter 1169. Lionel laughed again, flicking his finger and sending the sword spiraling upward. With a dull slapping sound, Lionel grabbed the sword by its hilt and sent it flying forward. A soothing whistle sound filled the air, only to be interrupted by the sound of blade meeting wood. A tree in the distance was directly split in the middle and it seemed that the sword might continue traveling right through it. But it was at that moment that something astonishing happened. As though it had been burnt from the inside out, the tree crumbled into a pile of ash, collapsing to the ground in a heap. The sword continued into the distance before falling not far afterward. Unfortunately, the ground it landed upon became like an ash land of death. The greenery withered, the rich soil turned to harsh granules, and a crater formed and collapsed, the weakened ground falling in on itself. Lionel whistled, the result being slightly more exaggerated than even he expected. Of course, this weapon was the result of Lionel applying what he had grasped from his innate node. It was just a low-level destruction force art, but the result was quite devastating. Though that was just a normal tree and ground, and the crater wasn't very large, barely half a meter in radius, they were both still tempered by a sixth-dimensional world even if they weren't anything special. To have them crumble like that, well, it spoke for itself. The only trouble was, almost as soon as the crater began to collapse, as though it had used up all its energy, the sword crumbled soon afterward. Lionel didn't even bother to go after it, he knew it was finished. Visit. For a better user experience as he had expected, weapons he incorporated these sort of force arts into would have a short shelf life. He had predicted that they would last maybe one battle, but judging by the result, it might not last even that long. They might be good as a trump card, but as a main mode of battle, Lionel didn't think they could be trusted. On top of this, they were expensive. Just to survive as long as it did, Lionel was forced to forge the sword of the sixth dimension or he had gotten from Patriarch Averone Radix's body. When he had tried the same thing with the fifth dimension it didn't even make it past the production stage. There were, of course, other problems as well. For instance, it wasn't scalable since Lionel was definitely the only one who could craft them. On top of that, they were obviously dangerous. Lionel wasn't sure how easy it would be for others to harm themselves with it. The destructive power is undeniable. I might just need to stick to using it with arrows and maybe bullets if I ever decide to go that route again. The Tier 9 gold bow should be able to handle firing those arrows up to a certain point. The only trouble is, where am I going to find so much sixth-dimensional ore? Lionel shook his head. Maybe instead of trying to find such things, he should instead focus on finding ores better suited to withstanding the destruction force arts. Alright, I'll leave this be for now. There's at least a proof of concept. I think I'll turn my attention back to the Luxnix family force art system now. Lionel's mind was like a machine working on the best sort of fuel. Everything was so clear to him and his minds worked separately and in unison completely seamlessly. He let little Tali go play with little Blackstar and he reallocated the minds he had put toward crafting back toward analyzing the ins and outs of this new force art system. One might think that this wasn't worth it. After all, Lionel's mother knew of the Luxnix force art system, yet all of her most powerful techniques used the Camelot magic system instead. So, wasn't it better to focus on the latter? Visit. For a better user experience, but Lionel saw it differently. After speaking with his grandmother and consulting the dictionary, he understood a bit more about the world spirit. The reason why all of his mother's most powerful techniques utilized Camelot's system and not the Luxnix was because she had Earth's world spirit, not the three-pillar world's world spirit which was divided between the three families. Simply put, his mother had perfectly grasped Camelot's magic system without even trying to its greatest depths. In fact, she was only limited by her current dimension level. When it came to the Luxnix, though, her comprehension was shallow by comparison. Realizing this, Lionel understood that there was still great potential in the Luxnix system. Just when Lionel was about to completely close himself off again, he looked up, realizing that his brothers were all approaching him with complicated looks in their eyes. "Huh?" Lionel blinked. "What's wrong with you all?" Joel shook his head. He was certain that Lionel already had a guess, probably multiple. But he still started to speak. "Leo, this is how things are." Lionel listened silently, not interrupting even once. His expression wasn't cold or indifferent, he simply looked like he was listening to a friend tell him a story. He nodded from time to time and even hummed in agreement depending on the circumstances. If one didn't know just how much all of this should have mattered to Lionel, they would have never thought there was anything wrong with his actions. Visit. For a better user experience. The decision is up to you. Joel finally said. "I'm with you, Cap," Raj supplemented. After hearing the truth behind things, even Raj couldn't help but change his tune. In fact, he felt kind of bad for being so hard on her. But, in the end, the one he would follow would always be Lionel, even if it was at the expense of Aina. Being cursed from childhood, losing your mother, and effectively your father. Dealing with that sort of pain for a lifetime and having your insecurities amplified day after day. Raj couldn't help but be sympathetic. "I see." Lionel nodded and remained silent for a moment before continuing. "Unfortunately, I have no intention of saving her. All those years ago, Lionel had made his stance very clear to Aina. In fact, he remembered the exact words he had spoken that day. I know you have a heavy burden on your heart. All I want you to know is that I'm here to bear it with you. I just want you to trust me, lean on me. Never go off on your own and do something stupid because I will not come to save you. Do you understand me? Those words, he had spoken them and he had meant them. Visit for a better user experience. Chapter 1170. Joel sighed when he heard these words. He had already expected as much, but hearing it so clearly like this made him feel that it was unfortunate. Sometimes, Joel felt like there was some sort of God looking down on them and pulling these strings, making certain that they all looked as foolish as possible at any given time for their sick form of entertainment. For a long while, they thought that Aina was completely unworthy of Lionel. And, truth be told, she hadn't really done much to change their opinion aside from becoming extraordinarily beautiful. Unfortunately, this wasn't enough to move the needle for Lionel. Now, in an irony of ironies, it was they who wanted Lionel to step up. Of course, this wasn't for Aina's sake, but Joel believed that she was truly Lionel's best chance at happiness. Or, at the very least, if they didn't end up together, Lionel deserved some better form of closure than this. And yet, it was now Lionel who wanted no part of it. Lionel hadn't even bothered to say a word to Aina. They weren't face to face when she left, and he didn't even look in her direction after hearing Richard's announcement. No matter how you spun it, they just found it impossible to feel that such a thing was healthy. Joel wondered how they would take things from here. On one side, he wanted to support Lionel and his decision. After all, it was still Lionel's right to decide how they dealt with these matters. But, on the other, he didn't want Lionel to decide on something he would regret for a lifetime. Visit for the best no_vel_ed_g experience. Unfortunately, Joel felt that Lionel wasn't a normal person by any stretch. If it was someone else, Joel might think that they were just being vindictive and wanted their significant other to suffer just as much as they had, taking responsibility for their own decisions. But he simply couldn't find any rage in Lionel's eyes at all. No matter how good of an actor a person was, it was simply impossible for them to mask such a fresh wound so easily. Joel never got the chance to make his decision, though, because Lionel's next words seemed to close off any sort of chance they had. I know that you all might try to do something thinking it to be in my best interest, but I hope that you want. Lionel's gaze gained a sincere and patient light to it. I do not want my brothers to risk their lives, and the same goes with my grandmother. I only just began to reform a relationship with her and her body is quite frail now, she's no longer in her prime. Though my grandmother is powerful, she's not nearly as powerful as she once was and she's currently stuck at a bottleneck she can't break past. She has a lot of guilt on her shoulders even though I do not blame her. If you bring this possibility to her, I'm certain that she will go all out for a chance at giving me happiness. But, I need you all to understand that this path won't bring me happiness. If anything, it will lose me brothers and there's an over 80% likelihood that it will lose me my grandmother. Lionel matched each one of their gazes. He wasn't pressuring any of them, but he wanted to convey his feelings as clearly as possible. When he laid out the truth so plainly and succinctly, the expressions of the boys couldn't help but change several times. Visit for a better user experience. They subconsciously knew how dangerous these matters would be, but hearing it explained like this truly made them understand what kind of game they were trying to play. I can understand Aina's plight, however the risk is not worth the reward. I can't trade the lives of people I care about for the life of someone. I simply don't. Joel and the others felt their hearts tremble when they heard this. But it made Lionel's stance as clear as day. There was simply nothing else they could do to refute it. Judging by Lionel's tone, even though he didn't say it, if he felt that they were about to take action, he would stop them. He knew the date of the wedding just as well as they did, and it would only be a day from now. There was simply no time for them to devise any sort of plan that could fool Lionel. And even if they could, should they? Lionel sighed. I don't want these matters to weigh on you all, but I can't force it to not either. If it makes you all feel better, the current Aina can snap Richard like a twig and she's completely immune to poisons due to her ability. Unless one of the Viola family elders stands in their wedding chambers, no one could force her to do anything she doesn't want to do. And if she does want to do it, why should you all be the ones to worry about it? Just focus on your training. We have much bigger things to worry about and much bigger goals in mind. The 8 looked toward one another and nodded. Maybe this was the best way to look at things. Visit for a better user experience. They alone didn't have the strength to even think of challenging the Viola. And they had no right to put Lionel's grandmother in danger when he explicitly asked them not to. How would they even face Lionel if they came back with Aina but his grandmother was dead? What if he cut them off just like he had James? In the end, there was nothing they could do. The hours continued to tick by. Lionel spent a few moments relaxing with his brothers, mostly at their insistence, before he returned to refining his comprehension of the Luxnix Force art system. While part of his mind was on this, another part was on something completely different, though. Her father had something capable of erasing her personality, huh? Sparks flew within Lionel's dreamscape. Visit. For the best no_vel_ed_g experience 73% probability that it is another tablet based on currently available information. So, how do I get my hands on it? Chapter 1171. Lionel could think of a few plans, but judging by the fact that Aina's father was definitely well into the 6th dimension, he would have to be choosy with which one he approached things with. I also have to consider the possibility that her father is also aware of my own silver tablet. When Lionel was in a relationship with Aina, he didn't hide anything from her, that included the existence of the silver tablet. Not only did Aina know of it, but she was also well aware of all its abilities and even the details on how Lionel ended up with it. Savon also mentioned that it was a bronze tablet? Is there a difference in strength with the color? It's possible, but there aren't enough data points. It could also be related to the type of power it has instead rather than anything else. But if they both have the ability to wipe personalities, maybe not. The easiest method was maybe to force Meal to exchange the tablet for saving Aina. This may work. I wouldn't even have to save her, I would only need to stall the wedding. Judging by how things are going, the Viola are likely invested in Aina's talent. That means that regardless of who her husband ends up being, their main goal is to ensure that she remains within their family. Because of how close the event days are, if I sneak into the Viola family compound and kill Richard, the Viola would have no choice but to postpone the wedding. The optics of forcing a woman to marry someone else right after their fiancé died would be terrible. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. Of course, there's also the chance the Viola wouldn't care. But even then they would still need to wait a day or two. By then, the second day of the selection would begin. Aina would have to participate, so there would be opportunity for her father to snatch her away and bring her to safety. This was the first plan Lionel thought of, but there were a few issues. For one, if it was so easy to get to Richard and kill him, Meal would have probably done so personally already. However, the reason Lionel thought it was still possible was because the Viola family was well aware that they had offended Meal, they would always be on guard against him. The other problem was how Lionel would sneak in to begin with. Yuri and Savon were probably having their movements monitored by now. In fact, if the Viola were smart, they would already know everything about their movements to begin with. They definitely know that Yuri and Savon contacted Joel and the others. That would put them even more on guard and makes things even more difficult. Damn. Seems like it's not worth it. The risk-to-reward ratio wasn't there. Lionel refused to put his grandmother's life in danger, which meant he would have to do it himself. And though he was confident, he wasn't foolish. Not only was there a high likelihood he would die while the Viola were on alert, but the reward in return was likely not to be worth it. If the bronze tablet was just a weaker replica of his silver tablet, he would gain nothing from this. Visit. For the best no_vel_ed_g experience in that case, we need to minimize the risk more. Aina's father should be present during the 2nd and 3rd days of the selection. I think I can modify a force art technique of the Luxnix into a perfect tracker. By then, I can just deal with him and take the tablet away when I'm strong enough. It probably won't take long. Lionel's force surged, forming delicate tendrils. Soon, a spider the size of a fingernail appeared on his palm. It scurried around under his control before touching Lionel's spatial ring and vanishing within it. Lionel closed his eyes and made some quick calculations. Several problems need to be fixed. First, I'll modify the shell of the spider. It needs to be more transparent to the point where any light that touches it goes right through. Alright, I'll adjust this point here. Though it won't be perfectly invisible, it won't be a problem under my control. The second issue is that crossing the spatial barrier of a treasure weakens it considerably. That cuts down the effective range significantly and it would deteriorate to nothingness in just a few days. I'll have to change the base element of the creation into the spatial element and have it fuse with the spatial force of the ring, creating a sort of symbiotic relationship. That way, so long as the ring lives, the spider will live. The solution to the second problem should also fix the third. So long as the spider and ring become one, The ring itself will become a beacon and signal only I can see and hear. Perfect. Lionel sat in silence for several moments, his calculations finishing in rapid succession. The latest _AP_SODIs are on _the website. His eyes opened and his dream force surged once more. This time, it almost looked as though nothing at all appeared on Lionel's palm. But even if you looked closely, it almost looked like a droplet of fresh water. It was only after Lionel activated the second awakening of his wisdom branch and his eyes sharpened that he could see the beautiful crystalline body of the little spider. Excellent. I should be able to pick out Aina's father based on the energy signature of the Brazinger family when the time comes. I've seen and met enough of them. Lionel nodded to himself and didn't mind this matter anymore. So long as he and Meal were on the same planet, he would be able to find him with this method. As for the matters with Aina, he no longer needed to worry about them. Whether she got married or not had nothing to do with him. The minutes turned to hours and then days. Soon, it was the surprise event many had been waiting for, and the marriage union of Aina Brazinger and Richard Viola was here. Those who had gotten themselves a place in the arena soon began to appear in the Viola estate one after another. If it wasn't for the fact that many other sectors were also having their selections now, they would have likely sent representatives of their own as well. The grand event was beginning. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Lionel, however, was in his penthouse suite, having finally begun to take his rest seriously. He snored lightly and peacefully, his head resting on a cloud of pillows. Chapter 1172. Aina sat within a luxurious room upon a well-cushioned stool. Before her, a mirror lay reflecting her image back to her. In her palm there was a pair of scissors. She held them open and up to her hair, thinking about how short she should cut it. But for some reason she was hesitating. It's a bit amusing, she thought to herself. If I really was a vampire, I wouldn't have a reflection at all, now would I? It was a completely random and almost painfully childish thought. Ever since she woke from her sleep, Aina had found her long hair very annoying. She couldn't use it to attack like some other people with weird abilities, and she always had to compensate for it in battle so that her opponent couldn't take advantage. She couldn't for the life of her understand why she had allowed it to get so long. What was especially frustrating was that every time she entered her peak battle state, her vitality would be stimulated and it would grow even longer. By then, she would have to trim the ends just to make sure she wasn't sweeping the ground with her every step. My facial structure is pretty good, I could probably pull off going completely bald. As Aina was lost in thought, she heard the sound of footsteps and her door clicking open. She lowered the scissors in her hand, forgetting her original purpose as she met the gaze of the person who had entered through the mirror. The current Yuri was red and puffy-eyed. She didn't look like she had gotten an ounce of sleep, but for someone as powerful as her, missing out on a single night's rest shouldn't have been enough to put her in such a state. Visit. For a better user experience, as though she had to sneak around, she carefully closed the door behind her and locked it soon afterward. Her chest beat so wildly that it seemed that her heart might fly from her chest. Aina? Yuri's voice almost carried with it a pleading tone. Looking at her friend? No, her sister of so long, she felt as though someone was stabbing her through the heart repeatedly. The current Aina looked as beautiful as an angel. The custom of white wedding dresses of Earth wasn't shared here, but none of that stopped her from shining like she was her own star. She wore a dress of violet that wrapped around her proud peaks tightly before falling somewhat loosely down her hips and legs. Her delicate shoulders were adorned by a silk shawl embroidered with patterns of purple blooming flowers, and her forehead wore a minimalistic crown of gold. Her hair was meant to be done up with a very special hairpin reserved for the ladies of the Viola family who shared similarly high status. This job was to fall into Yuri's hands, but judging by her appearance, she wanted to use this chance to speak of something else entirely. Aina blinked. Her gaze looked Yuri up and down, seemingly trying to analyze something. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. You can't go through with this. Aina's head tilted. Didn't we already have this conversation yesterday? Why are we having it again? Hearing such a response, Yuri felt like banging her head against a wall. She knew that she shouldn't be doing this, she should be allowing Aina to stumble and fall on her own, just like one would in real life. Only this way would she be able to rebuild her personality the way it had been before. But Yuri just couldn't accept this. Aina was her treasure, the one person she respected to the depths of her soul, maybe even more than her own adoptive father. She had watched Aina go through so much as nothing more than a little girl. She couldn't stand the idea of her image and sense of self being tainted in this way. Plus, who went through life without receiving any sort of advice? Emil knew of the danger of Aina not reawakening to her true self soon enough, so he took a hands-off approach, trying to expedite Aina's growth by allowing her to maneuver through situations alone. But then hadn't he been forced to step in due to the Void Palace anyway? Everything was a mess. Everyone seemed to be trying to do their best with what they were given, but life and circumstances kept forcing them to trip and fall. Aina, Yuri said with more urgency. If she couldn't get Aina to agree, any sort of escape plan was meaningless. If the person in question didn't cooperate, any small chance they had was nil. Visit. For a better user experience, the truth was that Yuri knew it was helpless. After 2 days they had no plan. Emil hadn't said anything to her, she had contacted Joel again only to learn that Lionel had refused, and now there was no one but her and Savon. In fact, if it wasn't for Savon stalling the other maids, she wouldn't even be able to be here to speak to Aina alone and give it one more try. Yuri, I know you worry for me, but there is really no need. The likelihood of escaping the Viola is near zero, and even if we do, we'll be hunted down. The only escape would be getting accepted by the Void Palace, but why would the Viola allow me to continue to participate if we somehow manage to escape? It's one thing to run away, but if there's a location they know we have to be at, what good would that do? Aina's words had suddenly gone from overly childish to coldly calculative. Yuri grit her teeth. At least do what I asked and speak to Lionel through me. If you have his grandmother's help, there'll be little the Void Palace can do to stop you from participating. Aina looked toward Yuri as though she was looking at a naive little baby. Didn't you see how the Luxniks treated them? If Richard asks a favor of the Luxniks, do you think she could stop the combined might of the Luxniks and Viola all on her own? Plus, I've already said I won't contact him. Why not? Yuri completely lost her cool, unable to hold it back any longer. This isn't the time for pride. This is your life we're talking about. Visit. For a better user experience, Aina shook her head. Because he's a man of his word. He said he wouldn't come, so he won't come. Yuri felt that all her air had been forcefully pulled out from her body as she fell to the floor. Chapter 1173. The hall the Viola had chosen for the wedding wasn't much of a hall at all. There was no ceiling, and the ambience was only enclosed by tall pillars holding up nothing more than the sky. The grass was a fantastical shade of violet, the waters shared a light shade of pink, and the trees in the surroundings all had white bark and delicate silver leaves. The picturesque scenery seemed like it was pulled right out of a fairy tale. Even with the thousands of guests present, with even more still coming, no one seemed willing to ruin the sheer beauty of it all. The conversation filling the air was often quite benign and uninteresting. But, of those that were worthy of note, many revolved around this curious turn of events. The marriage of a crown heir was most definitely worth at least this much fanfare. The trouble was, there actually wasn't enough of it. For an event of this scale, it should have been announced months ago. Pillar families and organizations from across several sectors should have made an appearance, and the wife in question should have been a well-known figure for ages. After being blindsided by this information, many began to look into this Aina Brazinger character, and her background only made them more curious. She was the daughter of a vassal of the family, but it wasn't an eternal vassal, but rather a first-generation one. This was quite surprising. Outside of this, she didn't seem to have any other background. Her mother was unknown and presumed dead, while her father was quite low profile. The only standout feature, aside from her overwhelming beauty, was her merits in clearing zones. Unfortunately, information on this was quite scarce and guarded. Though this made perfect sense. After all, the highest-rated zone Aina had entered for the sake of the Viola was one related to the Silver Empire. This was obviously information she kept close to herself, and whatever she was forced to disclose was kept well by the Viola family. The only reason everyone didn't assume that Aina was a flower in a vase, picked out by Richard because of his lust, was because her performance during the first day of the selection had spoken for itself. How could any of them look down on what they had seen that day? Visit. For a better user experience, that said, this didn't stop those with nothing better to do from placing her firmly atop the list of this sector's beauties, a list that contained women who hadn't moved their positions in several decades. On this list there were princesses of families, famous entertainers, and even the spouses of some of the most powerful men of the three-pillar sector. And yet, she was placed number one. Among the growing crowd, Gradier sat in silence. Every so often, someone would send him a look of disdain or pity, but he simply pretended as though he hadn't seen anything at all. Ever since he lost the battle for Crown Heir, he had been fairly silent. He didn't reprimand his younger brother for being his Achilles' heel, nor did he snap. He continued about his business as though nothing had happened and like he hadn't lost something he had spent his whole life working toward. Today he sat at a wedding that may very well should have been for him had things not gone the way they had gone, but he continued to respect the rules of etiquette and took his loss in silence. He too had participated in the selection and managed to get a spot on the second day, but so had many other members of the Viola family. There was nothing special about his achievement and it flew under the radar as usual. He was never as calculating as Richard, but he was a man with his own pride and he would continue to act as such. The inflow of people began to slow. The number of invitees was easily pushing 10,000, making this a truly grand event. They all took their seats and began to wait patiently, their eyes sparkling as they laid eyes on the large purple lily that stood upon the large platform ahead. It had veins of gold and shimmering petals that swayed gently in the wind. It was the perfect centerpiece for such a grand wedding. Visit for a better user experience, and then the delicate sound of music began to play. In a separate location within the Viola estate, the atmosphere wasn't nearly as lively or beautiful. The lights were dark and the air was especially heavy, the scent of blood and sweat leaving a thick stench in the air. Standing tall there were 4 men. Of them, 3 were well into their middle ages and the last was a youth just entering his prime. Among the 3 middle-aged men, 2 seemed particularly subordinate to the last, but this didn't change just how powerful they were individually. Without fail, all 4 of these men had flickering violet irises, carrying with them a depth of amethyst that danced between the vibrant color and the shade of black. Of the 2 weaker middle-aged men, one was particularly tall, his chin, jaw and cheeks covered by the shadow of a short and scruffy beard. His posture would remind Lionel of Hephaestus and he seemed to contain the same hidden explosive power within his limbs. The latter was quite fat and stocky, having such a large belly that one would have trouble understanding just how he walked through doorways. However, rather than jiggling, his belly was like a bronze cauldron, hardly shifting at all with his movement. These 2 men were none other than eternal vassal Rojan and Chindi. And that made the identity of the last all the more obvious. The strongest of the eternal vassals and the right-hand man of Patriarch Viola. Eternal vassal O'Brien. The latest _sodies are on the website. And yet, right this moment, they were all gasping for breath, their bodies beaten and bloodied, many of their bones broken, and standing amongst a litter of corpses around them. To think that even after being schemed against to this extent, poisoned, trapped within a formation designed specifically for him, and sapped of his right to gather force from the atmosphere, it would still take so much to slow him down to this extent. The young man spoke slowly, his gaze flickering. If he wasn't so cautious and hadn't prepared so many contingencies, there was simply no way this would have succeeded. Among the dead there were even countless main family members. The Viola had actually lost 20% of their 6th-dimensional experts to this one battle. He almost couldn't believe it. If the Viola elder knew they would take such a loss, they would have never done this. But who could have known that this person would actually have hidden so much of their strength? The young man's head tilted up, familiar music drifting to his ears. Hearing this, his frown faded and his smile returned. In that case, I guess I'll have to thank you for your efforts by marrying your daughter. The young man turned and flashed away. There was no doubt that this young man was Richard. As for the man beaten to within half an inch of his life, lying chained to the ground before them all. Visit. For the best no_underscored_undersng experience, it was none other than Meal, Adam Rainier Brazinger, Ana's father. Chapter 1174. The music drifted throughout the Viola estate. Yuri, who had barely cobbled her emotions back together, found herself crying once more. It was like the beautiful sound of plucking strings and warm horns was instead the call of death to her ears. Her fingers trembled as she tried to delicately form the strands of Ana's hair. Step by step, her long hair became an elaborate bun. If it wasn't for how blurry Yuri's vision was, she would probably think it was really beautiful. Luckily, she still had her internal sight to rely on, or else she would be a true mess. As steadily as she could, she placed the ornament of Viola family women atop Ana's hair, completing her hairdo. This dress is a bit uncomfortable. It would be easiest if there was at least one slit down the leg. Aina spoke to herself, having long since realized that Yuri was beyond saving. If this was a life-or-death situation, she might just have to leave her behind completely. The childish and out-of-place thoughts in Aina's head didn't seem to stop. She hadn't made any sort of progress at all. Yuri pulled away, trying hard to control her breathing. At that moment, there was a light clicking noise as the doors opened once again. Yuri's head snapped back like a frightened kitten. But when she saw that it was Savon, the rock on her chest instead got heavier than lighter. It suddenly hit her that the opportunity Savon had gotten for her was wasted once again. She hadn't been able to budge Aina at all. Savon, seeing Yuri's pale, tear-streaked face, sighed, realizing the truth without having to hear it explained to her. Deflated, Yuri collapsed onto a nearby couch. Soon, the maid Savon had distracted would likely come back. And, with the music playing, it likely wouldn't be more than 5 minutes before Richard was here to truly begin things. The marriage ceremonies of the Viola weren't very heavy on tradition. Outside of the hairpiece heirloom, there wasn't much to abide by. However, there were still its own set of rules. The latest _IP_SODs are on the website. This grace period of music that was playing now was actually for the people to give their well wishes and blessings to the couple before the ceremony began. During this time, a silence would fall over the wedding hall and a peaceful meditation would take place. Beneath this silence and the music, the flower centerpiece would begin to bloom. The blooming of the flower represented the budding of lifelong happiness. Once the flower was on the verge of blooming, the soon-to-be husband and wife pair would walk down the aisle together. Their walk would be timed with the final blooming of the flower, and their stepping onto the stage would coincide with the maturity of said flower. The timing and control of all of this was taken under the man's lead. As he would be the head of the household, it was his responsibility to take on. The better timing the husband had, the stronger his leadership skills and the more blessings the flower would bestow upon their union. Of course, Richard would never ruin the timing of his own wedding, so there was no way that he would be late. And even if he was, no one was naive enough to believe that the Viola didn't have their own methods of making sure that this tradition of theirs was followed to the greatest degree possible. There were definitely many tricks and techniques they could use to slow or speed up the progress. In the end, there were no real blessings to be had. It was just a hint of superstition from an olden age and a ceremonial practice. They had all already run out of time. It was over. Savon sighed. Forcing a smile, she walked to Aina's back, meeting her gaze through the mirror. You look very beautiful. You will make Richard very happy. Aina blinked. I'm not interested in making him happy. Savon raised her brows. And why is that? The latest _AP_SODs are on the website. It seems foolish to worry about the happiness of someone that doesn't really care about your own happiness. Aina responded as though it was very obvious. Isn't it very hard to make someone you don't know happy? Savon asked. What makes you happy? Fighting and eating. Aina replied with a beautiful smile. Being logical doesn't make you happy? Aina paused, not answering immediately for the first time. Not really. It just makes him happy. Does it make him happy? Or is that just what you think would make him happy? Is there a difference? I know him very well. Aina didn't feel this was refutable. She did know Lionel very well. She even knew exactly how he would react to this exact situation. In fact, she was certain that he wasn't even thinking about her right now. Truthfully, she was very annoyed by this, but she had already decided to be logical. Since she was being logical, how could she be illogically angry? He had already warned her and he was simply following through with what he said he would do. What would being annoyed change? Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience. Unfortunately, it didn't seem that Aina had grasped the ability to differentiate between outward shows of emotion and inward showings. She thought that what someone showed them on the outside was exactly how they felt on the inside. It was a very childish way of viewing the world. She still had the emotional maturity of a toddler. But now that she was feeling this mix of external and internal emotion, she was suddenly confused. Was there a difference between what she thought and the reality? Savon's question left her wondering. Savon. Aina suddenly spoke before Savon could respond. Ichem? Yes. I have been very, selfish? Yes, selfish to you, right? But you are still here. Is it because you lack backbone? Savon was stunned by these words. She wasn't sure whether she should be angry, sad, or enraged. She managed to calm herself down, but shuddered when she met Aina's gaze again. Was that a bad question? Did it make you angry? I'm sorry. Savon was stunned again. That was the first time Aina had ever apologized since she lost her personality. The latest _sodies are on the website. Unfortunately, Savon never got the chance to respond. At that moment, the doors opened much more forcefully than they had before. And this time it was Richard standing on the other side. Chapter 1175. Richard looked nothing like a man who had just been standing at the scene of a bloody crime. His robes were a deep violet, almost black, embroidered by a deep dark gold color. On his lapel, the symbol of the viola sat, intertwining in flowers and vines, while his tall collars were embroidered with twin-horned dragons. When this sort of outfit was matched with his noble disposition, his cascading black hair and his deep violet eyes, he gave off the feeling of a refined, handsome and confident gentleman. Richard had a light smile on his face, but it froze somewhat when he saw the crying Yuri. He couldn't have something like this ruining his wedding. Judging by the situation, it seems it would be best if the two of you just stayed here. Originally, Richard didn't find there to be any problem with allowing Yuri and Savon to attend. A wife without friends would raise more questions than answers. It was already odd enough that Aina had no family background to speak of. However, if he had to choose between that small oddity and Yuri leaking tears, it was obvious which he would choose. Yuri immediately wanted to protest, but Richard had already snapped his fingers. Several of the maids, one of whom had sixth-dimensional strength, came forward. Seeing such a scene, Richard couldn't help but feel a bit of heartache. It was a good thing that the three-pillar galaxy had been at peace for a very long time now, or else the Viola family might very well fall due to this choice of theirs. Losing 20% of their sixth-dimensional forces in a single sweep was absolutely unheard of. Even now, Richard could hardly believe it. He was able to ignore the troubling feeling this caused him because he was simply too excited to take Aina as his own. But ultimately, women were just women. One day he would grow bored of Aina and this trouble would come back around full circle. By then, he wouldn't be able to ignore it any longer. The latest _sodies are on the website. There was good news though. They had managed to capture him alive so they could more easily control Aina in this way. Also, there was definitely something special about Meal and his blood. It was even possible for them to strengthen their lineage factor in the future. Should they succeed, it would all be worth it. It's fine, the area was too closed off. We should be able to keep this a secret for at least a decade. By then, we would have already recovered. Seeing that the maids had come back, Yuri and Savon could only accept their fate in silence. Aina, it's time. Richard's expression softened. Aina nodded and stood. Due to her current stature and the shoes she wore, she was even a small hint taller than Richard now, something that made his lip twitch. But he buried it deep within. Today was his day, he wouldn't let anything stain it. Hold on a moment. Richard frowned, but Savon continued to speak quickly. It's just a small adjustment. I only want to wish my friend good luck and fortune. Savon appeared before Aina and helped her to fix the last wrinkles of her dress. Do you really want to know? Savon asked. The latest _sodies are on the website. Aina blinked before remembering what they had been talking about. Then she nodded. My grandparents died. My parents died. My siblings died. I tolerate the things you've done to me, because I have no one else. So yes, I guess I am lacking backbone. If I was more like Lionel, maybe things would be easier for me. Aina remained silent for a long while. No one else? Savon let Aina go and returned to the couch to sit by Yuri's side. In silence, Aina walked out of the room with Richard by her side. She shuffled forward in silence, seemingly not hearing the small attempts at conversation that he was making. We will have to wait until after the selection for our honeymoon, but I have amazing things planned. You must not have seen a lot of the dimensional verse yet, right? There are all sorts of extraordinary places. For example, in the Murata sector, there's a world formed entirely of a thick mass of water. Its ice caps have such a dense amount of water force that when it snows, it precipitates force crystals. Every 10,000 years, after enough accumulation, it will enter a blizzard state where the entire planet becomes encased in a thick layer of ice. If you're lucky enough, there's a chance that it could snow pure force crystals. Richard continued to babble on, but when he looked toward Aina's side profile to catch a glimpse of her otherworldly features, he almost snapped. She wasn't paying attention at all. Visit. For a better user experience, Richard had always been good at controlling his emotions, plotting and scheming in the background. But with the months he spent trying to court Aina, only for her to insult and belittle him at every turn. His patience had long since been wearing thin. He was truly about to snap, but his reason took over once again. Taking deep breaths, he closed his eyes. It was then that Aina suddenly spoke. "You have the smell of my father's blood on you." Richard's gaze flickered. But he had just calmed himself, he wouldn't lose it again so quickly. "Since you know, then there's even less to talk about. Be obedient and he will be fine. Step out of line and he won't be. It's that simple." "You believe that I care for his safety enough to do every and anything you say?" Usually such a question would have some sarcasm laced into it, but Aina's tone was indifferent and almost spoken as though she was genuinely asking. Richard's expression couldn't help but change after hearing this. "Wasn't how things were supposed to go? My father has always raised me to be a weapon to seek revenge for my mother. Anything that compromises that isn't something that he will accept. Even if he dies, so what? Do you think that this is enough to control me?" The latest _AP_SODIES are on _the website. Aina's gaze finally turned toward Richard, but when their eyes met, the latter felt as though his soul had left his body. The cold chill and the scent of death had practically grabbed onto his nose. Aina looked away just as quickly. "I am doing this so that I can go to the Void Palace. At the same time, you will receive the social credit of being my husband, not to mention a stake in my future. Don't do unnecessary things and make me look down on you even more." Aina continued to walk forward, her gaze becoming somewhat vacant once more. She still couldn't quite grasp Savon's meaning. But it should have been simple, no? You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.